The Medici.
Catherine de Medici, Part 2.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
Catherine de Medici, Part 2. The last 30 years of her life. The period on which we now enter is a strange one, full of the most violent contrasts. The latter half of the 16th century in France is a time when all the elements of a tragic drama are at their height. Only the music of a Wagner could do it justice. Rivers of blood flow. Lives are thrown away for a bagatelle. Balls alternate with massacres. At one moment, thunder, lightning, and dark clouds. At the next, a blue sky, the soft sound of music, and sunshine amidst gardens of roses. Stilettos ornamented with pearls. French gaiety and wit, even in the midst of terror and death. One thing only stable, a universal courage. Such are the characteristics of an epoch in which two streams, the barbarism of the Middle Ages and the refinement of more modern times, met in a conflict of tossing waves before the former was finally overcome by the latter. The women of this period are peculiar to their time, differing entirely from those of any other century. And properly to appreciate any one of them, we have to realize the exceptional atmosphere in which they lived, and of which they formed so prominent a part. Fearless, capable, learned, vivacious, full of energy and common sense, half pagan and half Christian, deeply religious at one moment, and at another consulting astrologers and purchasing love potions, riding like Amazons, fond of danger and dressing, music and love, assisting at tournaments, accustomed to bloody sights and cruel sufferings at a period when all held their lives by a very slender thread, a mixture of laughter and tears and stoicism. They are full of contrasts and surprises, while yet at times intensely human and intensely interesting. And where such women found themselves placed in positions in which, in an age of fierce conflict and violent passions, they were called upon to govern states, they perforce developed the qualities necessary to such conditions. Thus of Jeanne d'Albret, niece of Francis I, and mother of Henry of Navarre, it has been said that she was a queen in whom nothing was woman but her sex, a soul wholly given to manly things, a mind capable of great affairs, a heart invincible by adversities. And the same might have been said of either Catherine de Medici or Elizabeth of England. All three of them were like women of iron, and had need to be so. It was an age in which, in addition to the greatest ability, the qualities required, in order to obtain for those over whom they ruled the one blessing which is the greatest of all to a country, the blessing of peace, were a will of adamant, a rigid impassibility, a steadfastness unconquerable. And it is to misunderstand the whole epoch to condemn them for not possessing those qualities which we admire in women rulers in our age, and for possessing those sterner characteristics which were the need of their time if they were to preserve those over whom they were set from the most grievous evils. Such a character, for instance, as that of our deservedly honored Queen Victoria, would in that age have been simply crushed, and would have been of no use to poor passion-tossed France. In stormy weather, ships' anchors must be made of iron, not of gold. And in coming to this third period of Catherine's life, we reach a stormy time indeed. M. Imbert de Saint Amand, referring to the dangers which lay before her on coming to power, says: "Never had a more overwhelming burden rested on a woman's shoulders. A Blanche of Castile's force of soul would not have been great enough to struggle against the tempests about to be let loose on France." The period of Catherine's life which now begins, the 30 years from 1559 to 1589, is that of the reigns of her three sons, who in turn succeeded each other. Her eldest son, Francis II., coming to the throne at 16, only reigned for a year and a half, 1559 to 1560. Her second son, Charles IX., succeeded his brother at the age of 10, and reigned for 14 years, 1560 to 1574. Her third son, Henry III., succeeding his brother at the age of 23, reigned for 15 years, 1574 to 1589. During the 17 months of her eldest son's reign, Catherine had a little more power than before her husband's death, Francis II being entirely ruled by her opponents, the Guises. But during nearly the whole of her second son's reign, Catherine was Queen Regent of France, while during her third son's reign she was, though not regent, the most important of his advisers, striving to keep his indolent and foolish character from bringing his throne to disaster. Thus during nearly 30 years she was the most important person in France. Before coming to the detailed history of those years, it will be well to glance at the task by which she was confronted, the qualities she possessed for coping with it, and the general characteristics of this, the most important of the 3 periods of her life. And although during the first 17 months of this period she did not obtain the control of affairs, yet this space of time being so short, we may disregard it for the moment, and look at these 30 years as a whole. First, then, as to the evidence on which we have to rely. Controversy has raged for 3 centuries over the events of this period, with the result that the evidence by which we have to judge of Catherine's character and conduct during this portion of her life is to the last degree conflicting. By some she is represented as without ability, discernment, or breadth of view, full of vacillations and shifty compromises, walking as the moment prompted, one whose only motive was a lust for sovereignty, an intriguer, working out the tangled schemes of a changeable and baleful policy, and caught in her own snares. According to others, she was endowed with an ability and power of discernment seldom seen upon a throne, one who brought to the cause of a distracted country a power of endurance in adhering to a wise but difficult course, an intelligence and a strength of character worthy of the highest praise. Thus she is by some represented as the ruin, and by others as the salvation of France. But while the writers of the former class are steadily tending to become less credited as fuller information becomes available, they also frequently refute each other. Thus those who have held her responsible for the massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day are contradicted by so great an authority as the historian Michelet, who in his antipathy to the Italian woman will not allow to her ability or importance of any kind, treating her with cold disdain, calling her a nonentity, and saying, "Never had she either the idea or the courage required for such a massacre." Her admirer Tavannes overrates her, I consider, and exaggerates in attributing to her the idea of Coligny's death. To this a later writer, M. Armand Baschet, nourishing an almost equally strong feeling against Catherine, vigorously responds, "Desiring to be more than true, you are worse than false. To listen to you, one would think Catherine de Medici knew not even the first word about politics," pointing out that in thus acquitting Catherine of having caused Coligny's death, Michelet destroys his own argument by acquitting her of that which is the chief charge against her. Honoré de Balzac, on the other hand, while he praises her living chastely in the midst of the most licentious court in Europe, considers that the enormous crimes and destruction which were being committed throughout France by the Protestants justified even such a massacre as that of St. Bartholomew's Day, thus exonerating Catherine on grounds which admit all that her worst enemies have said. A fourth authority, Brantôme, who lived in the midst of all these events, remarks, "She has been strongly accused of the Paris massacre. There are at least 3 or 4 others who might be more justly accused of it than she. while he is never tired of praising her goodness, her wisdom, her peacemaking endeavors, and her grief at seeing so many nobles and people perish in these bitter contests which were rending France. Lastly, a recent writer of her life, after admitting her freedom from prejudice, her tolerance, patience, and self-control, and that she gave no cause for scandal, asserts that none of these qualities in her were deserving of any praise, but were all due to bad motives, adding, "We shall follow her in these pages with admiration, but with hatred." The above afford an example of the conflicting opinions on the subject of Catherine's conduct during these 30 years. As before, however, our safest guides will be those dispassionate onlookers, the Venetian ambassadors, who one after another were accredited to the court of France. Their secret reports to their own government, those actions of hers which are admitted by all, and lastly her own letters, will together form a more reliable guide to the truth regarding Catherine de Medici than the writers of any other authorities that could be produced. Catherine was now, at the age of 40, at the full maturity of her mental powers, and with an ample sphere for their exercise at last opening before her. The long years of obscurity and repression had disciplined and matured her character, her abilities were at their zenith, and her knowledge and experience had been ripened by her having stood as an onlooker, watching the movement of the political world of France during 26 years with the discernment which she so abundantly possessed. There is ample proof in her letters that she intended to undo the harm which incapacity during the previous 12 years had produced, to pacify the passions which had been aroused by unjust and short-sighted methods of government, to bring the country to peace, advance its prosperity, and raise it high in the estimation of other countries. The crest and motto which she had adopted at her marriage was a rainbow with the words, "I bring light and serenity," and it is admitted on all hands that on coming to power she strove earnestly to carry out this motto. But unfortunately for Catherine, a widespread movement was sweeping over Europe, which made all such achievements, for the time, impossible. The great conflict over religion, which had so long been tearing Germany to pieces, was now spreading to France. Geneva and Rome were beginning to make that country their battleground. Already during the latter part of Henry II's reign, under the influence of Diane de Poitiers, an ardent opponent of the new religion, there had been cruel persecutions and executions on account of religion. By the time that Catherine became Queen Regent, the two hostile forces had become ranged against each other, and soon a religious war, that most vindictive of all wars, raged over France, tearing the country to pieces, devastating its cities, maddening its people, and making permanent peace unattainable even by the wisest administrator, until such time as the force of religious animosity had spent itself by the sacrifice of a hecatomb of noble lives. Throughout the whole period covered by the reigns of Catherine's second and third sons did this contest last, and for 5 years beyond it. Thus it was her ill fate to have to rule France just during that period which the effects of the Reformation would have caused to be the most tempestuous time in that country's history, whoever had been on the throne. However, when Catherine began her task, these things were hidden in the future, and the manner in which she endeavored to cope with it has won praise from numberless high authorities. The difficulties were immense. France was torn by a furious conflict between the Protestants, called in France the Huguenots, and the Roman Catholics, who plotted and warred ceaselessly against each other, while each endeavored to get the throne on their side, even by force, if in no other way. In this state of things, Catherine's determined policy was to refuse to take either side, and to endeavor to create peace between these implacable foes by compelling them to learn mutual toleration, and by holding an equal balance between them. When about 80 years later the same sort of struggle took place in England, the king took a side, with results which were disastrous to both throne and country. It was just this which Catherine foresaw, and struggled all the years of her power to avoid, and she shows considerable statesmanship in having set this endeavour before her. Catherine, more successful than Charles I., saved her son's throne, and again wrought peace between the two parties by her policy. But she did so at the price, which was inevitable, that both parties in turn abused her as double-minded. Every concession, or even bare measure of justice to one side, was immediately seized upon by the other as an offence, and asserted to be a departure from some previous concession to themselves, and to show dissimulation on her part. Nevertheless, Catherine steadfastly maintained her course, though opposed by every sort of difficulty. She had the wisdom to choose as her chancellor and chief adviser the enlightened and temperate Protestant, Michel de l'Hôpital, and with his assistance she was enabled to steer the course which she had elected to follow with at times considerable success, though under the conditions in which France then was, no peace brought about could be lasting. That she was not understood goes without saying. The course she was trying to carry out was many years in advance of her time. She was endeavoring to act as a constitutional sovereign would in these days, and to follow a policy of equal toleration to all, which did not come into fashion among the nations of Europe until some 200 years afterwards. Catherine exhausted every method of reconciliation. She passed measures favoring one side as much as the other. She gave appointments to Protestants as well as to Roman Catholics. She made mortal enemies like the Duke of Guise and the Prince of Condé embrace each other. She had as many Protestant ladies in waiting as she had Roman Catholic. Whereas in 1555 there had been only one Protestant church in France, 6 years later there were 2,000. But when a country is in the state in which France was, moderate courses are out of favour. The people at such times consider those who act thus to be lukewarm, and France was too wild with religious hatred, the fires of which were steadily fanned from Geneva and Rome, to be able to appreciate a tolerant course of action. How little the age was to understand or value a policy of toleration we may see both from the reports of the unbiased Venetian ambassadors and from those of the strongly biased Spanish ambassador, Chantenay. The Venetian ambassador, Sodiano, writes: "It is well known that several of the women who are most intimate with the Queen are suspected of heresy and bad conduct, and everybody is aware that the Chancellor, in whom she trusts, is an enemy of the Roman Church and of the Pope. We saw, too, how lukewarm were her efforts to protect the Catholic party." While the Spanish ambassador, Chantenay, writes to his master, Philip II: "Take into consideration that whatever is lawful at Geneva as to sermons, administration of the sacraments, and similar things, may be done with impunity throughout the kingdom, beginning in the king's house." To this policy Catherine adhered, in spite of obstacles which to most would have appeared insurmountable, even sustaining war from Spain rather than abandon it. And it is very significant, in connection with the degree of responsibility to be attached to her, on account of the massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572, to find that during the whole of the previous 12 years it was for her moderation and tolerance that she was abused by the French, not for conduct of the opposite kind, and that it was contemptuously said of her that she had the olive branch always in her hand. Nor do Catherine's own letters, reticent as they are about herself, fail to give corroborative testimony as to what was her endeavour and what her difficulties. Writing after her son Francis II's death to her ambassador in Spain, she says that her endeavour as Queen Regent will be to rehabilitate by degrees all that the malice of the times has destroyed in this kingdom. While to her daughter Elizabeth she writes that God has taken her brother, and has left me with 3 little children and a kingdom so divided that there is not a single person in whom I can wholly trust, and who is not swayed by party passion. There is no doubt that Catherine possessed all the qualities for a just and wise government of France, if only the religious strife could have been put down, or had never arisen. And we have numerous instances given us of the many improvements, even distracted as the country was, which she introduced into the administration. Like all who have greater abilities than their fellows, she had a joy in ruling, un affetto di signoreggiare, as the Venetian ambassador Cavalli calls it. It is a mistake to style this, as some have done, a lust for power. It is a quality which all possess who are fitted to rule. And so far from being a defect in Catherine, it would have shown a culpable want of energy if, endowed as she was with unusual abilities, she had not manifested this love of ruling. During this third portion of her life, after she had reached the age of 40, Catherine suddenly becomes charged with the wholesale commission of crimes of murder. Regarding this, all that need be said here is that the accusation specifies no particular individuals, and that, as it begins simultaneously with the religious conflict, it is presumable that there is some connection between the two matters. It may also be noted that it has been held by some well qualified to form an opinion on such a point, that the ignorance of the science of medicine at that time precludes the possibility of knowledge of the subtle poisons which are presupposed in all these cases, and that on that ground alone these stories should be rejected. Undoubtedly the people of that age imagined that they possessed subtle poisons, and were therefore ready to attribute death to such methods, just as they thoroughly believed in witchcraft, and the possibility of causing the death of a person by means of a wax figure transfixed with pins, and just as they believed in incantations, horoscopes, and the various mysteries of their imaginary science of astrology. But they deceived themselves in the one case as much as in the other. Murders by poison in that age, when they did occur, generally show the use of poison by no means subtle. And any such murders, if committed by Catherine, would have been able to be definitely specified. In connection with this general accusation, almost an entire literature has gathered around Catherine de Medici, of stories, based on no foundation, repudiated by historians, and often directly contradicted by the circumstances, of poisoned gloves, handkerchiefs, bouquets, and other things of the same kind. This literature has been preferred to sober history. But it has been pointed out by Creighton that such stories gathered round many prominent characters of that day, and are a proof, not of the guilt of the person concerned, but of the low morality of the age. These stories, while they gratified an appetite for sensation, assisted the endeavors of political opponents to blacken the character of the Italian woman. Among them is the well-known fable of the secret cupboards in the suite of the apartments occupied by Catherine at the Château of Blois, which a later age, in search of sensation, felt sure must have been intended for keeping her poisons, a story which once passed for history, but has now been exploded as entirely apocryphal. These ingeniously contrived cupboards were almost certainly intended for keeping the huge mass of secret correspondence which so prolific a letter writer as Catherine collected round her, and the copies of those letters which now fill so many volumes of the secret records of various countries. There was also another use to which a portion of these cupboards may have been put. Astrology was the fashion of the day, and in connection with it a large paraphernalia of minerals, drugs, and magic substances of many kinds were considered indispensable. Catherine was an ardent votary of this cult, and these cupboards may also have been partly used for this purpose. This taste for astrology surrounded Catherine with an atmosphere of mystery, which much assisted the growth round her personality of a literature of the kind mentioned. Apart, however, from these stories, looked upon by historians in the light of fables, and showing merely the low morality of the age and the bitterness of the religious conflict, there are two murders, and only two, with which Catherine has been definitely charged, one that of Coligny, and the other that of Lignerolles, an objectionable associate of her third son Henry, who mysteriously disappeared, and was presumably murdered. The former of these cases may be left to be considered when we come to that point in Catherine's history, but the latter may well be mentioned here, since it shows an example of the kind of foundation upon which accusations of this nature were credited in that age, and have been handed down to our own. The charge is founded on a single sentence in a contemporary diary, the anonymous writer of which, speaking of Lignerol's disappearance, curtly states, "The Queen Mother, with the full consent of her children, had him killed." Knowing as we do that the two parties in France at that time were ready to believe and propagate the wildest stories without any proof, and stuck at nothing in their abuse of a religious opponent, it is impossible to credit any statement of this nature made by either party unless it has independent corroboration from state papers or other similar sources. And a single bald statement like this certainly requires it in no ordinary degree. Yet not only is none such forthcoming, but also the statement itself contains its own refutation. For, knowing what we do of Catherine de Medici, who is there that will believe that she was the sort of person who, intending to commit such a crime, would discuss it beforehand with those daughters, for she could not, under the circumstances, discuss it with her son Henry himself, about whose character and training she was so abnormally strict? Still less that she would obtain from them a full consent to this secret murder. Yet this, preposterous as it is that which is involved by the statement on which alone this charge rests. Astrology did not by any means exhaust all Catherine's scientific tastes. She was interested in all branches of science, while both mathematics and mechanics had especially great attractions for her. Another branch of knowledge in which her sound sense is very conspicuous was that of hygiene, in which she was altogether in advance of her time. In opposition to the ideas then prevailing on the subject, she was a strong advocate for plenty of air and exercise, and in her letters to her daughters is found giving them unlimited good advice on this point. She was also much opposed to the conservatism of the day in medical matters, constantly urging the desirability of inquiring into new methods in medicine and surgery, and of taking note of new discoveries in medical science made in other countries. Catherine was a most indefatigable letter writer. Her letters deal with every imaginable subject, from the most important affairs of internal politics down to pleadings on behalf of innumerable protégés for whom she desired benefits, and the most minute directions about her children's health and how their clothes were to be made. And all her letters breathe a profound common sense. M. Armand Baschet says, "A just and veracious history of Catherine de Medici would be impossible without studying her private letters. Her ability, her penetration, her astonishing facility in overcoming all difficulties show themselves in all her expressions." And Michelet himself has said, "At the head of the Lobespin, the Pinard, the Villeroys, and other French secretaries, at the head of the Gondis, the Biragus, and other Italian secretaries, must be placed that untiring female scribe, Catherine de Medici. If there is no dispatch to draw up, she makes up for it by writing letters of politeness, compliment, or condolence, even to private persons." Reading of this indefatigable letter writing, which occupied so many hours of each day of Catherine's life, we look with renewed interest at the small cabinet vert in her château of Chenonceau, with her initials carved on the ceiling, which was her boudoir and writing room, and the place in which the greater part of her mass of letters and minutes on state affairs were written. Her labours were incessant, and the Venetian ambassador, Sigismondo Cavalli, says, "At table, or while walking, she is unceasingly conversing with someone on affairs. Her mind is bent not merely on political matters, but on so many others, that I do not know how she can endure and go through so much." M. Batifol states that she was the most extravagant of all the queens of France, but he adds that she was the one who, owing to her immense dowry, had the richest personal property. Her chief amusement was hunting, of which she was passionately fond, not merely when young, but throughout her life. She had many accidents. On one occasion she broke her leg out hunting, and another time, by a severe fall, fractured her skull, necessitating the operation of trepanning. But she continued to hunt until nearly 60 years of age. After one of these accidents she writes, "You ask for news of my fall, so I will tell you that it was a bad and heavy one. But, thank God, I was not much hurt, and am only marked on my nose, like the sheep of Berry." She was the inventress of the side saddle, and it must have required some courage to be the first to attempt to ride a horse in such an entirely new manner. Her son Charles IX. tells us that she was always very regardless of herself, for that she was of her nature very slow to complain, and says that she frequently neglected her own health, though so particular about that of her children. She bore pain with the endurance of a stoic, never complaining. In her old age, when constantly tormented with attacks of rheumatism, she invariably treats the matter with a passing joke at her own infirmities. All writers refer to her unusual courage in danger. When determined to drive the English from France, she insisted, in order to inspire the troops, on taking part personally in the siege of Rouen, and entering the battle, and when remonstrated with by the Constable and the Duke of Guise, only laughed and asked why should she spare herself more than they did. Her agreeable manners when she came as a bride to France have already been alluded to. On her becoming Queen Regent, this characteristic had greater scope, and we find all writers referring to it. Brantôme, always most enthusiastic when speaking of Catherine, expatiates in glowing terms on this point, saying that she was tall and majestic and of a winning presence, and that, as Queen of France and doing the honours of the court, she was most brilliant and magnificent, and nothing ever equalled her. And even Trollope says, "Catherine the Queen was one of the most graceful mannered women of her time. Grave diplomatists were fascinated by her conversation, and learned lawyers charmed by her affability." Whether it was her fault or her misfortune that she acquired a character, among later generations, for exceptional malevolence, and how far the character usually attributed to her has been a just one or the reverse, is a point regarding which the main facts of her life, as they appear in the fuller light now available, are best left to speak for themselves. Having thus seen what were the chief features of the task before Catherine, and the qualities she possessed for coping with it, we can now glance at the principal events of these last 30 years of her life, and how she bore herself through the stormiest period of French history.
On Henry II's death, his eldest son, Francis II., then 16, succeeded to the throne. He was sickly in body and intensely feeble in character, and it might have been thought would certainly have been under the domination of his mother. But the powerful group of brothers, the Guises, whom Diane de Poitiers had placed in the principal offices of the state, were by no means ready to sink into obscurity as she had been obliged to do, and chance now gave all the power into their hands. The feeble-minded youth who had become king was entirely swayed by his young wife, Mary Queen of Scots, who was now Queen of France as well as of Scotland, and of whom Catherine, in her letters at this time, writes, "Our little Scottish Queen has only to smile to turn all Frenchmen's heads." But Mary, herself also only 16, cared not at all about politics, and was chiefly bent on amusing herself. She was proud of her 2 crowns and her beauty, was surrounded by adulation and flattery, and in no mood to be occupied by such dull subjects as affairs of state policy. Therefore she was only too ready to leave the entire management of state affairs to her powerful uncles, the Guises, and the latter almost at once secured complete dominion over the pitiful and contemptible youth Francis II, using him simply as their tool, and effectually preventing Catherine from having any influence. Moreover, the religious question helped to strengthen this state of things. Diane de Poitiers had always been the bitter enemy of the new religion. and she and the Guises were determined, now that the latter had complete power, to exercise it by a vigorous stamping out, by the most ruthless methods, of Protestantism in France. And as Catherine was considered to have leanings towards the Protestant party, and at any rate to be exceedingly lukewarm, and certain not to be at all disposed towards the stringent measures which the Guises intended to adopt, they were determined not to allow her to have any control over affairs. So that Catherine, during her eldest son's short reign of 17 months, though outwardly occupying a more important position, owing to the removal from the scene of the Duchess of Valentinois, had practically little more power than she had during her husband's lifetime. And although Francis II began his reign by issuing a decree ordering his mother's authority to be obeyed as if it were his own, this became a dead letter, if it was ever intended to be anything else, and the Guises alone ruled France. To the Duke of Guise, Francis, by a formal decree, gave absolute authority over the whole of the military affairs of the kingdom, and to his brother, Charles de Guise, Cardinal of Lorraine, similar authority over the whole of the civil affairs, while one lucrative office after another was absorbed by them and their brothers. With the entire administration of the kingdom in their hands, the ambition of this family became more unbounded than ever, and they aspired even to set aside all the princes of the blood royal. Shortly after Henry II's death, Catherine, in her dejection at the loss of the husband she had loved, the incapacity of her eldest son, and the unquiet state of the kingdom, which threatened under the intolerant rule of the Guises soon to bring heavy troubles upon the throne, went off to Chaumont, before its transfer to Diane de Poitiers had been effected, to consult her astrologer Ruggieri, who had long lived there in a set of apartments in one of the towers of the castle, as to the future of herself and her sons. And then ensued that strange vision of the future kings of France, of which one Nicolas Pasquier, son of a member of the States General, tells us. How that the Queen Mother, being told by Ruggieri to gaze steadily into a large mirror which hung on the wall, when she would see the future kings of France appear in succession, while each of them would reign as many years as his apparition in the mirror made complete turns, in trepidation did so. First there appeared a pale and sickly youth, whom she recognised as her son Francis II, who slowly made one turn, and then faded from her view. Next came her son Charles, who, as Catherine breathlessly watched, made 13 turns and passed out of sight. He was followed by her son Henry, who rapidly made 15 turns and then suddenly vanished. Then entered on the scene Henry of Navarre, who, as Catherine, now unable to remove her gaze from this strange pageant, watched as one spellbound, made 20 turns, and likewise suddenly disappeared. Following him came a bright boy, who continued turning again and again, until when he had done so 30 times, Catherine in an agony cried out that she could look no more, and fainted away. So at least runs the legend, and the next day Catherine, much shaken by what she had seen, left Chaumont and never again saw the chateau where she had spent so many gloomy years, and the last visit to which had been marked by so weird an experience. But the residence which she had taken in exchange for it was the delight of Catherine's heart, and became during the rest of her life her favourite abode. Situated on the borders of the forest of Amboise, Chenonceau, which had originally been a mill, worked by the waters of the river Cher, had been gradually improved by successive owners, until it became a charming chateau, which about the year 1528 was bought by Francis I. Catherine had always coveted it, from the days when Francis I had taken her there on some of their hunting trips together, and it was another of the bitter things she had had to bear, that on the latter's death, her husband, Henry II, instead of allowing it to become hers, gave it to Diane de Poitiers. The latter had since enlarged and beautified it, and Catherine, now that it had at last become her own, was bent upon improving it still further. For a time, however, she was obliged to defer those plans until public affairs should become less troubled. For the condition of these now became most threatening, and it was evident that at the rate matters were proceeding, the throne would ere long be in serious danger. For the Guises were not long in embarking on the course they had determined upon as regards Protestantism. The Cardinal of Lorraine, especially, was a most baneful character for any country to be cursed with, being a violent persecutor, loathed by the people, and bent upon rooting out Protestantism by the most drastic methods. Jeanne d'Albret, Queen of Navarre, wrote of him that he would like to set households by the ears all over France, and he certainly succeeded in doing so. Under his administration of the country, the most cruel persecution of Protestants at once set in, and when, after a short time, Anne de Bourg, a sincere and earnestly religious man of very temperate views and high character, a moderate and a leading member of the Parlement, was condemned and put to death by the Guises for being a Protestant, matters reached a climax. The Protestants, backed it is said by Elizabeth of England, laid a plot while the court was at Blois to capture and put to death the Guises, and if possible to seize the young king and make him a Protestant, or if he refused, to make the Prince of Condé king. Catherine did not know what they were planning to do, but she was entirely opposed to the way in which the Protestants were being treated, as she considered that toleration was the only safe course for the kingdom, and hated the Guises, although as long as her son was ruled by his wife, and both of them by the uncles of the latter, Catherine had to stand aside and look on. But she writes, "When I see these poor people burnt, beaten, and tormented, not for thieving or marauding, but simply for upholding their religious opinions, when I see some of them suffer cheerfully with a glad heart, I am forced to believe that there is something in this which transcendeth human understanding." The Protestants, knowing of this sympathetic attitude on her part, and not knowing how small her power was, appealed to her against what was being done on the king's authority under the administrative powers which had been granted by him to the Guises, and she, unwilling to acknowledge how powerless she was, extracted a promise from the latter to stop the persecutions. But she could really effect nothing, and the persecutions continued. However, after a time she succeeded in getting a decree issued by the king forbidding the persecution of Protestants. But the Guises had no intention of obeying any such decree, and practically snapped their fingers in her face. Catherine consulted Admiral Coligny as to what could be done, and he told her, what she knew already, that the Guises were hated like the pest, and alone to blame for the disturbed state of the country. But it was easier to say this than to discover how to oust the Guises, who had become practically kings of France. Meanwhile, the Protestants were elaborating their plot, regarding which Calvin afterwards said, "Never was enterprise worse conceived or more stupidly carried out." The English Roman Catholics were suffered to find it out, and they informed the Duke of Guise, whereupon the latter promptly removed the king, the Queen Mother, and the court from Blois to Amboise, which was a more secure abode, and awaited events. At Amboise, the Guises, who desired to make the matter appear as formidable as possible to the king, so that they might punish with the greater severity those implicated in it, kept the courts in almost as complete confinement as though they were in a state of siege, the gates of the castle being shut, and the neighbouring roads patrolled by parties of cavalry. In March 1560, the conspirators made their attempt to capture the Guises and the king, but in such a feeble and desultory fashion that from first to last the so-called conspiracy presented no real danger to those concerned. So much so that there is even an appearance throughout the affair of the Protestants having been deliberately led on by the Guises to make the attempt, in order that the latter might be able to destroy as many of them as possible. Whether this were the case or not, the attempt was made in a manner most inadequate for such an enterprise. A few of the conspirators were found by the cavalry patrols lurking in a wood near the castle. A day or two later a larger band were captured. Condé, who had secretly been head of the plot, deserted his followers with their consent, and took his place at court, as though he had had no connection with the conspiracy. The rest of the conspirators, instead of thereupon abandoning the enterprise, as they would have been wise to do, foolishly advanced against the castle, though they could never have expected to take it. Their attack, feebly carried out, was easily repulsed. In the retreat, the greater number of them were taken prisoners, and the plot collapsed. The Guises, who headed the Roman Catholic party, by causing the king to place in their hands the entire civil and military administration of the kingdom, were not only able to persecute their religious opponents with impunity, but could also declare any actions of the latter in retaliation to be acts of treason against the king, and it was exactly this, making the throne take a side, carrying with it consequences of this kind, which Catherine, when a year later she came into power, refused to adopt. But the Guises, being violent partisans who were determined to root out their opponents, cared for no such considerations, and were governed by one sole aim, that of making their own party triumphant. They therefore now proceeded to punish all those whom they had captured, not as heretics, but as persons guilty of treason against the king. By this means, notwithstanding the king's decree forbidding any further executions on account of religion, they would be able nevertheless to put to death a large number of important Protestants. From the prisoners under torture, the Guises learned, if they did not know it before, that there had never been any danger to the king, and that the whole plot was aimed at themselves alone. And their vengeance, inspired not only by the desire of the triumph of their party, but also by fears for their own safety, was cruel and vindictive. Every Protestant throughout the country, round upon whom their soldiers could lay hands, was summarily hanged, drowned in the Loire, or brought to the castle to be beheaded. These massacres of their opponents went on for a month. Every part of the walls of the castle was disfigured by heads of the slain, and the Guises, in order to implicate the members of the court in their proceedings, forced them whenever they could to witness these executions, even the Prince of Condé being compelled by them to do so. Finally, in order to strike terror into all who might think of engaging in such plots against their power in future, as well as to assist in giving the desired appearance of a condemnation for treason against the king, the Guises arranged a public execution of the 57 principal prisoners, and made it as impressive as possible. They directed that the execution, fixed for the 30th of March, should be carried out in the presence of the whole court, and issued notices throughout the surrounding country proclaiming the execution and ordering all to be present at it. In obedience to this order, the people came in crowds and occupied hilltops, roofs of houses, and every point from which the scaffold was visible, while for the members of the court, the Guises arranged seats in tiers round the open space, as if for a fete. When the whole court, with the young king and queen and their attendants, the Queen Mother and her ladies, and the princes of the blood, including the Prince of Condé himself, had taken their places, the Duke of Guise placed himself close to the scaffold on horseback, and one by one the 57 gentlemen condemned to death laid their heads on the block and were beheaded. Catherine and the whole court were so horrified at this dreadful spectacle that they were thankful to leave Amboise on the following day for Chenonceau, where Catherine, to get rid of the horror of blood, arranged a series of garden fêtes to wipe out the effect of the terrible scenes which the Guises had created for them during the month they had passed at Amboise. Thus did Francis, Duke of Guise, and his brother Charles light the fires of civil war in France, which were to rage over that country for more than a generation. By certain writers, Catherine's conduct in connection with the above episode has been described with every epithet of condemnation. One French chronicler declares that the Guises arranged these executions as a distraction for the ladies, who were becoming bored at staying so long in one place. Others state that Catherine and her ladies were present at the spectacle and took pleasure in watching the tortures inflicted on the Protestants. Others that these executions were witnessed by the cold-hearted court from a balcony, as if they had been stage representations. And again that Catherine showed her cruel temperament by finding fault with the Duchess of Guise, when the latter wept copiously at the cruel shedding of so much innocent blood. Blood, by the way, which was being shed by that lady's own husband and his brothers. But the facts do not appear to bear out this colour which the French Protestant writers have put on them, though it was one natural enough, perhaps, to the friends of those who were being put to death. It was not Catherine and her ladies, but Francis II and his court, of which they formed a part, who looked on at these executions. And it was not as an amusement or from a wanton pleasure in cruelty that they were there, though the arrangements made by the Guises no doubt caused it to have that appearance to those whom Francis, Duke of Guise, and his brothers thus slaughtered. So far from its being any pleasure to the court to be there, we know that both Francis II, Mary, and many of the rest were almost fainting from the dreadful spectacle, and that it was just because Catherine and all of them felt so horrified at it that she arranged for them all to quit Amboise the next day and depart to Chenonceau. The Guises, in whose hands Francis was a mere puppet, insisted on the presence of the king and his whole court at these executions with a threefold object. First, to have to watch such an execution would tend to intimidate all at the court, who, like Condé, might be inclined to take part with the enemies of the House of Guise. Second, the presence of the members of the court on such an occasion would tend to embroil them with the Protestants, which was just the effect it had, causing the Protestant writers to declare that they were there as an amusement and to inveigh against them for such heartless cruelty. Third, any member of the court who refused to be present at the execution of those who had plotted against the king's authority and made an organised attack on his residence, could ipso facto be pointed at by the Guises as being an enemy of the king and a friend of those who had desired to make him their prisoner. It is not likely, for instance, that Condé would have been present as a spectator at the execution of those whose leader he had been, and who still honoured him, if he had not been forced in this manner. Hence neither Catherine nor any other lady of the court could be absent, and we see this exemplified in the case of Anna d'Este, Duchess of Guise, who, when she refused to go to the execution, was dragged there by the Guises by physical force, and when subsequently she said that she was sure God would have vengeance on those who took so many worthy gentlemen's lives, she endured much rough treatment and anger from her husband's brothers in consequence. And if Catherine said anything to her at all on account of her weeping, which is very doubtful, it was nothing more than a remark intended to urge her to maintain a due amount of self-control. Moreover, Catherine did not remain passive during these proceedings of the Guises. She made a strong endeavour to save the lives of many of the prisoners, and we are told tried everything she could, even seeking out these new kings in their chambers and caressing them, but without avail, for the Guises were determined to slay them all. It is also noteworthy, as showing that these condemnatory remarks upon Catherine in connection with this episode proceed more from bias than from any solid basis of fact, that although Mary Queen of Scots was likewise present at this execution, and as Queen of France occupied at least as important a position at it as the Queen Mother, while also we do not hear of her having importuned her uncles on behalf of the lives of any of these prisoners, as Catherine had done, yet none have ever made similar remarks regarding Mary Queen of Scots in the matter. The fact is that these ladies were all of them women of their time, and that to look on at an execution of this kind was not the same thing to them as it would be to anyone in these days. France was becoming far too much accustomed to such cruel deeds for women to fail to grow more or less callous to such sights. We may also remember that these ladies could both look on at executions and also bear themselves with calmness and fortitude when their own turn came to suffer in like manner. Their doing the former is no proof of cruelty on their part, as it would be in our days, and we, who live in more peaceful times, are in error if we impute cruelty to them, owing to our judging their actions by a standard which relates to an entirely different set of conditions. Catherine now succeeded in getting a council on the subject of the religious differences assembled at Fontainebleau, and at this council, notwithstanding the angry frowns of the Guises and their puppet the king, she spoke boldly against the policy which was being pursued regarding the Protestants, and stated that one half the people were Protestants, and asked sarcastically if it was supposed that the sword could be used against them all. Nevertheless, matters did not mend, and throughout the summer of 1560, plots on the part of the Protestants for a general rising throughout the south of France, including the seizure of Lyon, and imprisonments and executions of prominent Protestants on the part of the Guises, continued to take place. One artifice of the Guises did Catherine much harm in the eyes of the people of France, while it has largely affected the writings of the contemporary French historians who deal with the events of these 17 months. So long as the puppet king was entirely under their dominion, and so long as the entire civil and military rule of the country was by his decree vested in them, the Guises knew that neither Catherine nor anyone else could interfere with them. At the same time, they knew how greatly they were hated by the people, and to shield themselves as much as possible from the odium caused by their actions, they made the incapable youth who was their tool in authorising their proceedings from time to time quote also his mother's name as he had done in his original decree, thus making it appear as though their actions were done with Catherine's concurrence. And although she opposed them on every occasion at the court, she was powerless to take any action which would right her in the eyes of the country, so long as the position remained the same with regard to Francis. However, a time was rapidly approaching when she would be freed from this position and be able to show all men what her real attitude was. The Guises now began to fly at higher game, and planned to achieve the death both of the Prince of Condé and his brother, Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre, the two leading members of the Protestant party, and were not deterred even by the fact that they were of the blood royal, and next in succession to the throne after Catherine's sons. Condé especially was known by them to have been a party both to the plot which had ended at Amboise and to that for the seizure of Lyon. Accordingly, in September, the Guises caused the King of Navarre and the Prince of Condé to be summoned by the king to the court, which was then at Orléans, the king stating that he wished them to come and refute their accusers, and promising them a safe conduct and a friendly reception. Catherine could not have known what the Guises meant to do, nor would they have dreamed of letting her know it, and she no doubt did not believe that they would dare to take the lives of princes of the blood royal. For when Navarre and his brother showed reluctance to come, she wrote, begging them to do so as the king wished it so much, and that she and all the court would receive them hospitably. On their arrival at court, Condé was at once seized under the orders of the Duke of Guise and thrown into prison as a preliminary to his execution for high treason, while for the King of Navarre, who could not be thus accused, the Guises had another plan. So far from Catherine having plotted to take the lives of Condé and the King of Navarre, as has been maintained, her subsequent conduct in this affair completely disproves the assertion. The plot to which the Guises persuaded Francis to agree, and which they carefully kept concealed from Catherine, knowing that she would find means to frustrate it, was that he should summon Navarre to come to his apartment in a private manner and unattended. The only attendants on the king would be themselves and the Marshal de Saint-André. Francis was to reproach Navarre with the state of the country, and then in a sudden rage to strike him with his dagger, when the other three would assail him as defenders of the king's person and dispatch him. But Catherine heard of the plot just in time. She hastily sent the Duchess of Montpensier to warn Navarre of it, and told him not to go when an invitation came to him from the king. At the same time, she herself went to her son, and used all her powers to prevent him from obeying the Guises' command in this manner. The account of what took place and of how Catherine had saved his life was afterwards related by Navarre to his wife, Jeanne d'Albret, who published it in a manifesto in 1568. He told his wife that in accordance with the Queen Mother's warning, he disregarded the first invitation he received from the king, but on receiving a second summons, thought it would appear cowardly to refuse, and went. As soon as he entered the room, the Cardinal de Lorraine closed the door carefully behind him. The king received him wearing his dagger, and reproached him bitterly as he had been instructed to do, but Navarre, owing to the warning he had received, replied in so humble a fashion that he gave no opportunity to the king to display any wrath, and after a time Francis allowed him to depart unharmed, to the intense rage of the Cardinal de Lorraine, who, in disgust at the failure of the plot as he departed, burst out with, "Voilà, le plus potent cœur que fut jamais." Catherine was overjoyed at having been thus successful in saving Navarre's life, and herself related her part in it to his wife, Jeanne d'Albret. But the Prince of Condé was still held fast in prison, and the Guises, who knew that he was their chief opponent, were determined that his life at all events should not be saved. Catherine had succeeded in getting his prison changed from Orléans to Amboise, but that was all she could effect, and she writes an ambiguously worded letter, saying how strong the latter place was, and how impossible it would be for him to escape thence, apparently with the object of showing that the Guises need have no objection to Amboise as the place of his incarceration, concluding with, "I do not think that there is any place in all France where the prince could be safer or better looked after, that she intended to save his life if she could, is fully proved by what happened immediately afterwards, so that whatever else this letter may mean, it certainly does not mean that she intended to help the Guises to effect their purpose. Nevertheless, the latter secured Condé's condemnation to death, and got the sentence of death signed by the king, and the 10th of December fixed as the date of the execution. The Guises would not suffer even Condé's wife to see him, not even when she begged to be allowed to do so once before he died, to give him courage. Just at this juncture, Francis II fell ill, and a few days later this incapable youth breathed his last, after a reign of 17 months. He died on the 5th of December 1560, his name hated throughout France, owing to his surrender of himself and his kingdom to such a rule as that of the Guises. On Francis II's death, Catherine's second son, Charles, a boy of 10, succeeded to the throne. Catherine was made, during his minority, Queen Regent of France, and the first act of her power was one which tells directly against the view ordinarily held of her. The death of the Prince of Condé, who was marked out as the leader of the Protestant party, and whom they were already proposing to make king, must have seemed highly desirable, not only in the interests of Catherine's sons, but also in the cause of France, since the death of their leader might be expected to paralyse the Protestants, and prevent their commencing a civil war as they were now proposing to do. Catherine, whose affetto di signoreggiare had at last a chance of being gratified, desired greatly that scope for showing her ability for ruling which she would have as Queen Regent on behalf of a boy of 10. On the other hand, Condé's existence seriously threatened this. He had already headed 2 plots in succession which had as their object to place him on the throne instead of Catherine's sons, and he had been openly spoken of by the Protestants as Louis XIII. Condé, in his prison, was ignorant of Francis II's death, and supposed that he himself had but 4 more days to live, and Catherine had only to let the law take its course. This, however, was not the course which Catherine adopted. We are told, Guise saw that his power was at an end, knowing that during the minority of the next king, the Queen Mother would be regent. He at once went to her and urged her with all his force, for the sake of her own and her son's safety, to allow the sentence of death which had been passed against Condé to be carried out, and also to put to death the King of Navarre. Catherine flatly refused, countermanded the execution, and ordered Condé to be set at liberty. She then sent for the King of Navarre, told him she had had no hand in the schemes to take the lives of himself and his brother, and offered him her friendship on 2 conditions. First, that he would forego his claim to the regency, for which he had small desire and was not fit, and second, that he would make peace with the Guises, so that there should be an end to the strife between the 2 religious parties, which was threatening to desolate France. These terms he accepted, and he also was set at liberty, though Catherine must have had grave doubts whether he would keep the second promise, and she would have been justified, for he very quickly broke it. Thus did Catherine make her first essay in that long endeavour to be a peacemaker to France, which was to continue through so many years. We who have followed the course of the Medici have seen at least 3 other occasions in which conduct similar to this was displayed by them, and as Condé's prison doors roll back, we seem to hear an echo of Lorenzo's speech, that he who knows how to forgive knows how to rule. Catherine, on becoming Queen Regent, showed at once the line she intended to adopt, of endeavouring to maintain on the part of the throne that attitude of toleration towards both the religious parties which she justly considered to furnish the only hope of preserving the country from the horrors of a desperate civil war. Within a month of her being installed in power as Queen Regent, she published a royal edict dated 28th of January 1561, stopping all persecutions in consequence of religion, releasing all who were in prison on that account, and ordering that there should be full liberty given to the Protestant religion throughout France. At the same time, she wrote to the Pope, demanding that communion in both kinds should be administered to the laity, that prayers should be said in the vulgar tongue, and that certain other reforms in church matters desired by the Protestants should be carried out. For the above edict she was, of course, abused by the Roman Catholic party, who under the regime of the Guises had nourished high hopes of seeing Protestantism stamped out in France. And when a little later she similarly granted concessions for which the Roman Catholics asked, she incurred like abuse from the Protestant party, though there were a few among the latter who took a more balanced view, as, for instance, Longuet, who wrote that she sought to moderate all things. And throughout the years that followed, we find her always struggling to maintain the same attitude, and incurring odium, now from one side and now from the other in consequence, so that among the writings of the day, the assertions as to her duplicity and double-mindedness throve apace. This endeavour to maintain or recover peace by holding the balance between the two parties who divided France is the key to all Catherine's conduct. She strove for it earnestly, while as yet the two adversaries were only drifting towards war. And when at last they broke into open war, she again and again brought about peace by the same method, though only to find her efforts nullified by their inability to live peaceably together. And this long and strenuous effort as a peacemaker to France, notwithstanding that by no fault of hers it failed of permanent success, will ever remain Catherine's chief claim to praise. But the dark clouds which had gathered over France were not to be dispelled by any such efforts, forcibly as Catherine made them, nor until long-continued storm had poured itself out upon that country. Throughout the whole of the remaining 28 years of her life, that storm raged, and during that time France saw no less than 8 religious wars follow each other in succession, while the short interludes of peace were each scarcely more than a truce, during which the two antagonists collected their strength for a fresh contest. And bitter indeed was this conflict. Mézeray, who wrote about 50 years after Catherine's death, says, "If anyone were to relate all that took place at this time, in different parts of France, all the taking and retaking of towns, the infinity of small combats, the mutual insults and retaliations, the furies, the massacres, it would take up an immense number of volumes." Before, however, this great contest began, Catherine, during the year 1561, made 3 splendid efforts to avert it. With a greater breadth of view than anyone else in either France or England at that time possessed, she formed a plan to assemble a national church council of the leading Protestants and Roman Catholic authorities in France, and to direct their deliberations herself, on the lines of studying the institutions of the primitive church, investigating how far divergencies from the latter were the cause of the complaints made by the Protestants, and seeking to arrive at a settlement on this basis. This was a most remarkable proposal. There was no other sovereign in Europe then, or for many generations afterwards, who could have conceived the idea of assembling such a council, and of personally directing its deliberations on the lines proposed. And perhaps no other act of Catherine's more strongly brings out the ability and breadth of view which had been brought to the service of France by a Medici coming to occupy that throne. The idea was entirely Catherine's own, and her letters show how much she hoped for from it. And had she been able to carry out her own strong desire to keep the matter a strictly national one, and to prevent all outside interference, it is probable that success might have crowned her efforts, and France have been saved from all the miseries of the most terrible period in the history of that country. The proclamation ordering the assembly of this National Church Council was issued on the 25th of July, and on the 9th of September 1561, 3 weeks after Mary, Queen of Scots, a widow of 19, had bidden a sad adieu to France and sailed for Scotland, the council assembled at the monastery of Poissy near Saint-Germain. On the Protestant side were 32 leading Protestant ministers: Jeanne d'Albret, who was looked upon as a host in herself, the Prince of Condé, Admiral Coligny, and a number of Protestant nobles, while on the Roman Catholic side were 40 bishops, 6 cardinals, 12 doctors of the Sorbonne, the Cardinal of Lorraine and his brother, the Duke of Guise, the Queen Regent with the boy King and the rest of the royal family, the members of the Council of State, the Chancellor, Michel de l'Hôpital, and other important members of the court, made up one of the most impressive assemblages which France had ever witnessed. Catherine opened the proceedings by a speech expressing a hope that the debates might be so conducted as to bring peace to the kingdom. Fine addresses were delivered by the principal leaders on either side, and at first Catherine hoped for success. But on the 19th of September there arrived Cardinal Ippolito d'Este Ferrara, who held 3 archbishoprics in France, and also came as legate from the Pope, and with secret orders from the latter to stop the proceedings. And from the moment of his arrival all chance of a settlement between the two parties ended. Frequent scenes and furious discussions brought about an entire failure of this effort by the 26th of September, and Catherine's concluding speech, in which she dissolved the council, said, "We are sorely grieved that this meeting hath not produced that fruit we had wished, so needful for the love of the whole Christian Church." Catherine then tried another plan, and to avoid the angry recriminations of a large assembly containing many discordant elements, arranged a smaller conference, consisting of 5 of the leading Protestant ministers and 5 of the principal Roman Catholic clergy who were in favour of reforms. This conference was successful in arriving at a settlement satisfactory to both parties, and drew up a joint agreement on the disputed points concerning the Holy Communion, the chief point of dissension, and submitted this agreement to the bishops for their approval. But the latter, knowing that the Pope would never agree to it, refused their assent. Meanwhile, Catherine continued to carry out her broad-minded reforms, with a view to an equal treatment by the state of both religions. Various important posts were given to Protestants. Fresh decrees furthering religious liberty were continually being promulgated, and Paris, strongly Roman Catholic, saw appointed as its governor a Protestant, the son of the Constable Montmorency. But Catherine's difficulties were enormous. Not only were constant intrigues by both the rival parties to circumvent each other taking place even while these conferences were being carried on, but also every country around was eager to take part in the conflict and make France a general battleground in which the religious question which divided Europe should be fought out. And Catherine had to strive hourly against anything being done which would afford a pretext to any of these adjacent powers for intervening in the strife. Her chief embarrassments came from the fanatic Philip II of Spain. He kept at her court, as his ambassador, Thomas Perrenot de Chantonac, a man employed by Philip more in the capacity of a detective than as the envoy of a foreign power, and who threateningly told Catherine that he knew every detail of her days. Through him, Philip II menaced her perpetually with an armed intervention by Spain on behalf of the Roman Catholic party in France, while Chantonnet, knowing that France in its present disunited state was powerless to resist such an invasion, treated the Queen with the utmost insolence on every occasion that her policy of tolerance caused her to take any step to the advantage of the Protestants. On the opposite side of France, the Emperor was closely watching for some excuse to make war upon Catherine in order to recover Metz. Elizabeth of England was eagerly on the lookout for some pretext for taking arms on behalf of the Protestants, while from the Italian side, the Pope and the Duke of Savoy were both anxious to join in the fray. Catherine also laboured under another difficulty. Unlike her opponent Elizabeth, who was surrounded by a band of exceptionally able and reliable counsellors, Catherine was in this particular unusually ill-provided, and while surrounded by spies who watched and reported to their own governments every word and look of hers, she had not, as she truly said in her letters to her daughter, a single person about her in whom she could trust. At the very time that the conference, with a view to a peaceful settlement in religion, was sitting, a plot was set on foot by the Protestants to carry off her younger son, Henri, and set him up as a rival to his brother Charles. And another proposal was made, even in her Council of State, by one of the Roman Catholic leaders to seize herself and throw her into the Seine in a sack. This latter proposition she had the pleasure of herself hearing, through the tube which she had secretly had made from the council chamber to her apartment. Added to these various perplexities, she had daily to exercise blandishments, prayers, and remonstrances, in order to keep the leaders of the two parties from coming to blows, even at her court. And when the strain of so many anxieties told visibly even on her strong physique, the ambassador Chantonnet had the insolence to tell her that he believed that her indisposition was merely due to her eating too many melons, to which she replied with some dignity that it was not the fruits of the garden, but the fruits of the spirit which made her ill. Well might one of those acute Venetian ambassadors who watched and reported all these proceedings say that he did not know what ruler would not have made mistakes under so many difficulties, and express surprise that she did not give way to one or other of the two parties. Nor did any termination to this strain appear likely to occur. She had for a time, by her tolerant measures, put down the flames which had been ready to burst forth, but none saw more clearly than Catherine herself that they were not put out. And what she said in writing to her ambassador in Spain was only too true. The ashes of the fire which has gone out are still so hot that the least spark will make them leap up into bigger flames than we have ever seen. But Catherine was not yet daunted, and although both her first and second attempts to avert the impending conflict had failed, she made yet a third. Paris, violently opposed to her policy of toleration, broke out into tumults. Every Sunday there was fighting of some sort round the churches, and in these quarrels lives on both sides were lost. Whereupon Chantonnet had the effrontery to tell the Queen Regent that if she did not quickly put an end to these heretics, his master would come to the assistance of her Catholic subjects and would certainly make war upon her. But Catherine came of a family who were not to be cowed by threats like this, and she told him bluntly to tell his master that she would be mistress in her own house. Accordingly, in December 1561, she called a meeting of the States General, and made a powerful speech in favour of a policy of toleration, and then summoned a third conference between the two parties to meet at Saint-Germain on the 3rd of January 1562. Consisting of 30 presidents and councillors chosen from the 8 Parlements and 20 members of the Privy Council, including the princes of the blood. The proceedings began with a remarkable speech from the Chancellor in favour of allowing the two religions to live side by side in France. This was followed by a most powerful speech from Catherine herself in the same direction. After a debate of 12 days, a compromise was at length agreed upon, which, though not all that Catherine desired, nor completely satisfactory to either party, was more agreeable to the Protestants than it was to their opponents. Having thus at last obtained a settlement which an influential body of men, representative of both parties, could accept, Catherine drew up an edict following their recommendations, which afterwards became very celebrated under the name of the Edict of January. This, though it did not allow the Protestants to build churches, authorised their assembling for worship. Still more important than this, it gave them for the first time legal recognition, the state thus acknowledging 2 different religious bodies. But when this edict, containing such an entirely new departure, was sent by the Queen to the Parlement to be registered and published, they altogether refused to publish it and took up a most determined attitude. Catherine was furious. She at once mounted her horse and rode at a gallop from Saint-Germain to Paris, and, says the account, in good sooth it seemed as though she would gallop straight into the council chamber in order the better to demonstrate her absolute will and have the edict registered. She found the president and councillors obdurate. They declared that the edict would do evil to the kingdom and dishonour to God, and that nothing should induce them to register it. And at length the president rose to leave the hall, solemnly saying to the Queen, "Your Majesty is taking the road that will lose you crown and kingdom." But Catherine was as firm on behalf of her measure of toleration as the deputies were against it, and as we watch her standing alone before the Parlement, determined that they and not she should give way in a matter which she felt was the last chance of saving the country from civil war, suddenly before the mind's eye there rises that scene of 32 years before, at the door of the Murate convent in Florence, when she was a girl of 11, and the whole drama seems to have been acted before on a smaller stage, and we know which side will conquer, and so it turned out. For notwithstanding all the determination of the president and councillors, Catherine prevailed, and before she left the council chamber she had obtained a promise that the edict should be published on the following day, which was done. Though in publishing it the Parlement themselves attested that her determination had been greater than theirs by adding the words, "Published, read and registered in our Court of Parlement at Paris, by reason of the importunity of those who profess the so-called new reformed religion, and this only provisionally while awaiting the majority of the king."
This episode completed Catherine's first year of power, and that year certainly showed no insignificant tale of work. She could not undo the harm which had been done during the years when she had compulsorily been merely an onlooker, while incapacity of various kinds, first during her husband's reign, and then during that of her son, steadily drove France towards civil war. But on getting hold of the helm she made a fine effort to save the ship from the rocks even at the 11th hour, and her Edict of Toleration immediately on coming to power in January 1561, her proclamation of July assembling a National Church Council, her broad-minded reforms in the matter of giving appointments equally to those of both religious parties, her second conference in October when the first failed, her third conference proclaimed in December when the second failed, and lastly in January 1562, her celebrated Edict of January, which so often formed the basis of peace in the years which followed, collectively made a record of which any ruler of a country drifting towards civil war might well be proud. But all Catherine's efforts were rendered of no avail. The Roman Catholic party, headed by the Guises, declared her Edict of January to be intolerable, and that there could not be two religions side by side in France. The Protestant party declared that her edict did not go far enough, and clamored for further concessions. Several fights with the slaughter of opponents took place, and both parties now prepared openly for civil war. An intercepted letter from a Protestant minister disclosed to the Guises the fact that the Protestants were plotting a wholesale massacre of the Roman Catholics in Paris. The writer of the letter quoted the examples of Gideon and Judith, and said that he felt in his spirit a God-sent vocation to do this deed. 10 years later, on St. Bartholomew's Day, 1572, the Roman Catholics apparently felt the same vocation. Catherine, knowing that the object of both sides was to get possession of the king, withdrew with him to Fontainebleau, first ordering the Duke of Guise not to bring an armed force into Paris, an order which he promptly proceeded to disobey, whereupon Catherine, determined to keep the antagonists apart if possible, begged Condé to quit Paris, which he did. Guise, with a Roman Catholic force, seized Paris. The Protestants, under Condé and Coligny, seized Orleans and other towns in the Loire and the Rhone, and the first religious war had begun, May 1562. The Duke of Guise proceeded with a force to Fontainebleau, captured the Queen Regent and the King, and escorted them under a guard first to Paris, and thence to Melun, where, though treated with courtesy, they were practically Guise's prisoners, and were not allowed to communicate by letter or other means with the outside world. Elizabeth of England, joining in the conflict, sent over an English force which occupied Havre and Rouen, and the war rapidly spread in both northern and southern France. Meanwhile, Catherine, who after a time had managed to get free from the power of Guise, was struggling in every way to reconcile the combatants, but for some time without any success. Various battles ensued, in which at length the King of Navarre was killed, Condé taken prisoner by the Roman Catholics, and Montmorency by the Protestants. In February 1568, while the Duke of Guise was besieging Orleans, occurred an event which, while it assisted the cause of peace at the time, laid the seeds of still more bitter strife later on. This was the murder of the Duke of Guise, who, as he was riding unarmed back to his house, was shot by Poltrot de Méré, a Protestant who had attached himself to the Guises' army in order to execute this crime, and who at his trial stated that it was Admiral Coligny who had employed him to commit the deed, though whether this was true or not has never been made clear. Francis, Duke of Guise, was a noble character, and the most deservedly beloved and honored figure of that time, and his murder by the Protestants was the chief cause of the bitter hatred against Admiral Coligny and the Protestant party on the part of the Roman Catholics, which eventually culminated in the massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day 10 years later. This death of the commander on the Roman Catholic side, combined with the other events which had for the moment deprived both parties of the most fiery spirits among their leaders, gave Catherine an opportunity which she at once seized. She forthwith arranged a meeting between herself and the two chief prisoners on either side, Montmorency and Condé at Orleans, and in a few days had caused them to agree to terms of peace which were almost exactly on the lines of her Edict of January. And on her return to Amboise, where she was then staying, she was able on the 19th March 1568 to proclaim in an edict called the Edict of Amboise the peace which she had effected. Thus ended the first religious war, and Catherine was so delighted at her success that she is said to have danced for joy. She had a right to feel satisfaction, and her joy was not dimmed by any knowledge that 7 other wars of the same kind were to follow, in which the most arduous labors in the same direction were often to fail. She promptly carried off her children, Charles IX, Henry, Duke of Anjou, Francis, Duke of Alençon, and Marguerite, together with the Prince of Condé and his wife, the young Henry, now Duke of Guise, the other young Henry, now King of Navarre, and a brilliant company to Chenonceau for a happy week of festivities to celebrate the cessation of the war. These were varied and picturesque. Naval battles and water fêtes on the Cher were followed by fireworks and torchlight dances in the long galleries, while spirited encounters took place in the woods and gardens between troops of gentlemen and ladies of the court disguised as satyrs and nymphs. Having been so successful in causing the two parties to make peace, Catherine's next move was to bind them together as much as possible by urging that it was the duty of all Frenchmen to combine to drive the English from French soil, and entirely owing to her own enthusiasm on this point, She was able 3 months later to assemble an army commanded by the leaders of both parties, which advanced to attack the English in Rouen, and which she herself accompanied, going into the battle herself, and saying that she would never rest until she had driven the English out of France. The campaign was entirely successful, and in July the English force surrendered, and France was once more free from foreign invasion. It was the last time for many a long day that the two parties of Frenchmen were to be found fighting on the same side. Peace having been thus brought to France for a time, Catherine caused Charles IX, now 14, to be installed at Rouen, and then took him on a prolonged tour through France, both to make him acquainted with his kingdom and also to keep the court away from Paris, where religious animosity was always ready to break out. This tour lasted nearly 2 years, from the spring of 1564 to the end of 1565, in the course of which the court visited nearly all the principal places in southern France. The court numbered over 800 persons, accompanied by a huge retinue of servants, and there are graphic accounts of this immense progress, which was like a moving pageant. We hear of gaily dressed nymphs who issued from glittering rocks by the wayside, of shepherds who suddenly appeared and recited long Latin poems, and of various other diversions to beguile the tedium of the march. At Bar-le-Duc there took place the baptism of the Queen's grandchild, Christine of Lorraine, the child of Catherine's daughter Claude, and at Moscone Catherine was called upon to settle a fierce sectarian quarrel over the knotty point of whether in processions the children of Protestant parents could be permitted to walk side by side with these of Roman Catholic parents. Though the fires of civil war had been quenched, the ashes still smouldered, and while at Roussillon, Catherine found it necessary to issue a further edict, calling upon each of the two parties to respect the religion of the other. The court reached Bayonne in June 1565, where Catherine had arranged that her daughter, Elizabeth of Spain, was to meet them. There followed 3 weeks of balls, tournaments, and other festivities to celebrate this happy meeting. Elizabeth was accompanied by the Duke of Alva, afterwards of such evil memory in the Netherlands, who had come to Bayonne with a fixed programme, carefully settled beforehand with his master, Philip II, in accordance with which he intended to extort from Catherine agreement to 3 main conditions: the exclusion of all Protestants from holding any public office, the prohibition of Protestant services, and the expulsion from France of all Protestant ministers. And the Protestant writers have always maintained that at this meeting Catherine, with the utmost duplicity, made a secret compact with Alva for the extermination of Protestantism in France, and that the massacre which occurred 7 years later in Paris was the result of this meeting between the Queen Mother and Alva. But here we have a notable instance of how modern research overthrows long-established errors due to reliance upon the perfectly unscrupulous partisan writers of that epoch. For the above theory in connection with this meeting at Bayonne, a theory which had until recently become so firmly established as to be an accepted fact of history, has now been completely refuted by the publication of the Spanish state papers, including Alva's secret dispatches to his master Philip II. For these show that so far from anything of the kind having taken place, Alva, by his own admission, entirely failed to induce Catherine to agree to anything that he urged for the repression of Protestantism. He tells his master that he was unable to get her to agree to prohibit the Protestant preachers, authorized by her Edict of Amboise, or to dismiss her chancellor, Michel de L'Hopital, or to consent to any of the other proposals which he urged upon her. And this notwithstanding the lofty energy and consummate prudence displayed by the Queen of Spain to assist his efforts, adding that he found the Queen Mother more than cold for the holy religion. The court returned to Paris at the end of the year, and during the following year, 1566, Catherine, besides many labors to maintain the existing tranquillity on the religious question, was mainly occupied in getting, with the able assistance of her chancellor, a large number of very important enactments passed for the better administration of justice throughout France. These swept away numerous unjust practices of the courts of justice, and many abuses in the management of the police, which pressed severely on the people, and with which her recent prolonged progress through the country had made her acquainted. Many of the new laws thus enacted obtained a permanent place in French legal code, and were of lasting benefit to France. These 4 years, 1563 to 1567, were also a time of much activity on Catherine's part in other directions. Both of what were, until 1871, the two principal palaces in Paris are inseparably connected with her name. The Palace of the Louvre began a few years before his death by Francis I, on the designs of the architect Lescaut, was completed by the end of Henry II's reign, and Catherine was the first sovereign of France to occupy it, when she came to power after her son Francis II's death. And in the year 1564 she began building her own palace of the Tuileries, connected it with the Louvre by a long gallery passing through the crowded quarter of the city, which then occupied the intervening space. For this palace she employed the celebrated architect Philibert de Léormé, who had been ousted from royal favour by the Guises during Francis II's reign, but whom Catherine on coming to power reinstated. Besides this work she was also busy in making extensive improvements at Fontainebleau, Genonceau, and others of the royal residences, in collecting objects of art of all kinds, and in patronizing literature. And notwithstanding all the storms of war through which France passed during the years of Catherine's rule, they form a notable epoch in French literature. The poets Ronsard, Du Bellay, Belleau, Binet, and other lesser stars having made this period famous by their collective name of the Pléiade. Catherine's Edict of Amboise, supplemented by that issued at Roussillon, had kept France free from war for 4 years. The religious animosities, however, fomented on the one side by the Calvinists in Geneva, and on the other by the intolerant temper of the Guise faction, at length again blazed out, and in September 1567 the second religious war was begun by an attempt made by the Protestants to seize the person of the young king while the court was at Meaux. The Battle of St. Denis followed, in which the Constable Montmorency was killed. During the next 6 months severe fighting took place in various parts of France, in the course of which the Protestants took Rochelle, which became their permanent headquarters. Eventually, in March 1568, this second war was brought to an end by the so-called Peace of Longjumeau. How untiring were Catherine's efforts to maintain peace, and how great the difficulties of the task, is shown in the reports of the various ambassadors. Thus the Spanish envoy Alava, in one of his secret reports to Philip II, informs him that as the queen was coming one day from the council chamber, and when he, being pressed by her to say why he looked at her as he did, remarked in reply that her eyes were swollen with weeping, she said, "It is but too true, but I have every reason, for alone and single-handed I bear the burden of affairs. You would be amazed," so she spoke, "if you understood what has just happened. I no longer know in whom I can trust." Again the Venetian ambassador, Giovanni Correr, reports thus: "I do not know what prince would not have made mistakes in such a great confusion. How much more a woman, a foreigner, without trusty friends, frightened, and never hearing the truth from those about her. For my part, I have often been surprised that she did not become thoroughly confused, and give way to one or other of the two parties, which would have been a final calamity to the kingdom. It is she alone who has preserved the remnant of royal majesty still to be found there. For this reason I have always pitied rather than blamed her, and she has often reminded me of it when speaking of her distresses and the woes of France." Words such as these give a vivid picture of the difficulties which Catherine's policy entailed on her, and of the ability with which she adhered to it. Nevertheless, difficult though it might be, the correctness of that policy is shown by the ambassador's remark that her abandonment of it would have been a final calamity to the kingdom. The peace made at Longjumeau proved but of short duration. The two parties had no real intention of becoming reconciled, and in August 1568 the Third Religious War began, and was fought with great ferocity on both sides. 2 months after it began, Catherine heard of the death of her favourite daughter, Elizabeth of Spain, at the age of 24. Catherine's grief thereat was very great, but she had little time to indulge in it, as the terrible state of affairs which now supervened in France claimed her whole energies. In March 1569 was fought the Battle of Jarnac, in which the Prince of Condé was killed. That which Catherine had long laboured to prevent now occurred, the participation of other countries in the conflict. A German army entered France to assist the Protestants, and a Spanish one to assist the Roman Catholics. And with the entrance upon the scene of these foreigners the contest took a more savage character. The leaders on both sides gave orders to their troops to give no quarter. City after city, upon being taken, was sacked. Whole garrisons had their throats cut, and the war assumed the appearance rather of one between fanatical Hindus and Mohammedans than between people of a civilized race. The time was a terrible one for both Protestants and Roman Catholics. The various woes suffered were enormous, but all that we are concerned with in this history is Catherine's conduct in connection with them. The Protestants, who could not be retaliated upon in the same way, delighted in destroying and defiling everything which in the eyes of their opponents was sacred. They demolished churches and mutilated shrines. They dragged crucifixes and relics in the mud. They gave the Holy Sacrament to dogs and cattle and greased their boots with the holy oil. They profaned the sepulchres of the ancestors of the reigning family. They burnt at Cléry the bones of St. Louis, King of France, and at St. Croix the heart of Francis I. They destroyed the beauty of every building on which they could lay hands, and in short poured out their fury upon everything which to the French people represented refinement, care for religion, and pride in the past history of their race. This conduct roused their antagonists to frenzy. A cry of fiercest wrath and a vow of vengeance went up from all Catholic France, and instead of one massacre of St. Bartholomew's Day, it was more to be expected that there should have been a dozen such in different cities of France. And in fact we find contemporary writers, after that massacre, speaking in this very strain, and saying that it was no more than a due retaliation for all that the Protestants had done throughout France, not only in massacring their opponents, but also in their hateful destruction and desecration of everything revered by the latter. How deeply Catherine felt all this misery, which in spite of her strong efforts to avert it, had descended upon France, can be seen in her letters. She says, "I do not think there is anyone in the world who can feel more pained and horrified at the atrocious evils wrought by the foreign troops than I, who am dying of it on my feet." The popular feeling of maddened indignation and hatred was most of all rampant in Paris, while second only to the citizens' rage against the Protestants was their wrath against the Queen Mother for her tolerant edicts allowing to Protestants liberty of worship and prohibiting persecution of them. The Parisians declared her policy to be like ordering the cats and the rats to live at peace together. They petitioned for leave to abandon France and go to live in some country where they might practice in freedom the Catholic religion. And when she ordered her edict of toleration to be read to the people from the pulpits, the priests not only refused to do so, but again and again referred to her in their sermons as Jezebel. It was no wonder that Catherine wrote, "All the towns in the kingdom would not cause me one half the evils I endure from Paris alone." Nor is it any wonder, with Protestants in such a state, that they could commit the enormities which have been mentioned, and with the Roman Catholics calling the Queen Mother Jezebel, because she would persist in allowing their enemies liberty of worship. No record of Catherine's actions emanating from either side is to be relied upon, except where such is corroborated from more trustworthy sources, or by facts admitted by these writers themselves in formulating their indictments against her, as for instance this one of her persistent pursuit of a policy of toleration. Catherine at this time, feeling Paris an unsafe abode, and knowing, on the other hand, how eager the Protestants were to capture the young king, while southern France was in too great a state of conflagration to afford an asylum, carried him off to Metz, where for some time the court took refuge. She still labored for peace, and on the same lines of mutual toleration and rights. If those who started the war had had the patience to let us complete what we had begun at Saint-Germain, we should not be in the difficulties we now are in regard to bringing about a durable peace, which after all, even when it is obtained, cannot be more satisfactory to both parties than the old Edict of January. After various important cities had been taken and retaken, the Battle of Moncontour was fought in October 1569, at which the Protestants, now commanded by Coligny, sustained a severe defeat. More sieges followed, but at length, in August 1570, Catherine succeeded in bringing the war to an end by arranging the Peace of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, in which the terms obtained by the Protestant party were even more favourable to them than those contained in her Edict of January. Nevertheless, as the result, Catherine only reaped abuse from both parties. Philip II, urgently demanding that the war should be continued until the Protestants were completely crushed, was full of wrath at any peace having been made. The Roman Catholic party in France declared that the terms of the peace which the Queen Mother had arranged were far too favourable to their foes, and that the vanquished had been treated as though they were the victors, while the Protestant party declared that the terms were not favourable enough, and also that they were only a trap laid for them by the duplicity of the Queen Mother. But Catherine had to consider France as a whole. The country was utterly exhausted by these furious wars, its condition altogether deplorable, and a cessation of this fratricidal strife absolutely necessary. Any peace between two combatants which strikes at all an uneven balance between them is always considered unfair by both. That which Catherine had effected at Saint-Germain-en-Laye was of this nature, and Monsieur le Valet speaks no more than the truth when he says, "It was another effort to make the two religions live together, and to give some repose to exhausted France." As to the accusation against Catherine of duplicity on this and other similar occasions, while they are only what was to be expected from the state in which France was, they probably gained their chief material from the necessity perpetually laid upon Catherine, if France was not to be invaded by the Spaniards, of outwitting Chantenay, between whom and herself an hourly duel, on his part in order to discover what were her intentions, and on her part to hide them from him, was ceaselessly fought. Undoubtedly this peace was a great triumph for Catherine, the second of this kind which she had gained, for the results proved her wisdom. Notwithstanding the wrathful grumbling of the Roman Catholics that the terms were too favourable to the Protestants, and of the Protestants that they were not favourable enough, France quieted down, and the Protestants went to their prish and the Roman Catholics to mass without molesting each other. Catherine was overjoyed at her success, and though she saw that after so fierce a storm the waves could only be expected to calm down by degrees, she had good hopes of being able to create permanent harmony, and, as she says in her letters, make a nation of France. Speaking of those who declared that the miseries of France had all been caused by her refusal to suppress the heretics, she writes, "If things were even worse than they are after all this war, they might have laid the blame upon the rule of a woman, but if such persons are honest, they should blame only the rule of men who desire to play the part of kings. In future, if I am not any more hampered, I hope to show that women have a more sincere determination to preserve the country than those who have plunged it into the miserable condition to which it has been brought." Catherine now had leisure to turn her attention to other affairs than the miseries of war, and to think of matrimonial projects and artistic concerns. Her palace of the Tuileries was by this time nearly finished, and she delighted in laying out its gardens, and in arranging to adorn them with all sorts of examples of the new art in earthenware pottery which had been invented by the celebrated Palissy. She had a year or two before rescued him from extreme poverty, as well as from persecution as an ardent Protestant, and she now established him as superintendent over these various works at the Tuileries. At Chenonceau also she was busy in laying out new gardens on an elaborate plan, and here too she employed Palissy to assist her, while in many other directions she indulged those artistic tastes which she had inherited. The marriage of her children also now occupied her attention. The peace between the two rival parties in France enabled her to set on foot 3 matrimonial projects, all intended to cement the reconciliation and make it permanent. These were the marriage of her son Charles IX, now 20, to Elizabeth of Austria, the daughter of the tolerant Emperor Maximilian II; that of her next son Henry, Duke of Anjou, to Elizabeth, Queen of England; and that of her daughter Marguerite to Henry of Navarre, the son of the redoubtable Protestant Jean d'Albret. The first of these marriages, that of Charles IX to Elizabeth of Austria, was soon carried out, and they were married in November 1570. The negotiations for the marriage of Elizabeth, Queen of England, to Catherine's son Henry, or failing him with his younger brother the Duke of Alençon, dragged on for years and were eventually dropped. But the third marriage, that of the Princess Marguerite to Henry of Navarre, was also carried out, and took place 2 years after that of her brother Charles. Elizabeth of Austria, Catherine's new daughter-in-law, was virtuous, wise, and had in every way a charming disposition. Having no taste for politics, she occupied her time almost entirely in numerous charitable works, and was looked upon by the people as a saint. She was very sincere in her religion, and when at her coronation, at which she was to receive the Holy Communion, various unforeseen delays caused the ceremony, instead of taking place in the morning as intended, to be delayed until 3 in the afternoon. She remained fasting the whole day, and although, it being feared that she might faint, authority was given for her to break her fast, she would not do so, and, says the record, received the Holy Communion at 6 in the evening, as upright and gay as though it were 6 in the morning. The difficulties in the way of Catherine's project for the marriage of her son Henry of Anjou with Elizabeth of England were mainly created by the Pope, who foresaw in it a possibility of the Church of France seceding from his authority in the same way as the Church of England had done. But great as these difficulties were, those which had to be overcome in connection with the project for the marriage of the Princess Marguerite with Henry of Navarre, which marriage was Catherine's main attempt to bind the two hostile forces in France together, were greater still. For not only was the Pope equally opposed to this project for similar reasons, but also Henry's mother, the strong-minded and stern Calvinist Jeanne d'Albret, had great doubts as to whether she could allow her son to marry a Roman Catholic, much as she desired the match from every other point of view. However, having at length made up her mind to agree to it, but to keep her son as much as possible away from Roman Catholic influences, she came early in 1572 to Paris in order to conduct the negotiations herself, ordering her son to remain in Navarre until she had completed them. Jeanne d'Albret had been in bad health for some time, and the feverish energy with which she threw herself into the preparations for her son's marriage exhausted her remaining strength. Finding her health failing, she summoned her son from Navarre, but died in Paris on the 9th June before he arrived. Catherine visited her on her deathbed, and wrote in admiration of her patient endurance of her sufferings. It has for 3 centuries been a favorite story that Jeanne d'Albret was poisoned by the Queen Mother by means of a perfume which Jeanne had bought from Catherine's perfumer. The story, which had its origins in libels published by the Calvinists at Geneva, had been repeatedly disproved by the most reliable historians, as well as by reports of Jeanne d'Albret's 2 physicians, Caillard and Desnoux, both of them Protestants who had written many things against the Roman Catholic party, and would at once have denounced such a crime had it occurred. But nevertheless the story continues to hold its ground. No amount of disproof, nor even the fact that Catherine was scarcely likely to endeavour to overthrow a plan which she had so long laboured to achieve, having had any weight against so fascinating a piece of sensational fiction. The most recent authority on the subject dismisses the story in the following words. A legend that she, Jeanne d'Albret, had been poisoned long formed one of the stock charges against the Queen Mother. There is as little evidence for it as for most of the similar accusations brought in those days. Henry of Navarre, accompanied by 500 Protestant gentlemen, arrived in Paris a few days after his mother's death, where Admiral Coligny, the young Prince of Condé, and a great concourse of the Protestant party were already assembled for this marriage, which was to heal all wounds and bind the two parties firmly together. And on the 18th August 1572, the Princess Marguerite and Henry, King of Navarre, were married in the midst of a grand assembly of all the principal men of both parties, and with much magnificence. A ball at the Louvre followed in the evening, and the festivities continued throughout the next 3 days. But this great gathering of the rival parties in a city at all times so inflammable as Paris had serious dangers for the preservation of the state of outward tranquillity which had now been maintained for 2 years. The things which the Protestants had done in desecrating and destroying all that their opponents held dear were not forgotten, and the citizens of Paris, who had so long loathed Catherine's policy of toleration towards their opponents, were roused to a white heat of animosity at seeing the marriage of their king's sister to the leader of the rival community, while many of the attendant circumstances of the ceremony were highly unpalatable to them. On the other hand, the majority of the Protestant party liked the marriage no better, thinking they saw it in a design to entrap their leader, Henry of Navarre, into becoming a Roman Catholic. Neither party, so far as their subordinate members were concerned, took any pains to hide their contempt and hatred of the other, or to avoid offending their religious sentiments. Even the marriage ceremony itself, at which the whole body of the Protestant gentlemen had ostentatiously withdrawn when the celebration of the Mass began, and gone to walk up and down outside in the gardens, provided fuel to the slumbering fires. Moreover, there were still deeper causes of enmity at work. Henry, Duke of Guise, the leader of the Roman Catholic party, looked upon Admiral Coligny as the treacherous murderer of his father, Francis, Duke of Guise, a crime which Henry, his mother, and the whole family of Guise were firmly determined to avenge on the first opportunity, Henry's mother being specially urgent with him to take this vengeance. So that this marriage, intended to bind the opposing forces together, had within it all the elements for a fresh outburst of their enmity. Hatred and suspicion were rampant on both sides, and it needed but a spark to set all Paris in a blaze. That spark was soon supplied. On the 22nd August, 4 days after the marriage, Admiral Coligny, walking from the Louvre to his house, was fired at from the window of a house inhabited by one of the retainers of the Duke of Guise, and wounded in the hand and arm. The king and queen mother, knowing the seething state of Paris, and being in the greatest anxiety lest anything should be done by either party which might bring on a conflict and a civil war in Paris itself, immediately on hearing of this outrage, visited Coligny, expressed the greatest concern at what had happened, and sent the king's own sergeant, Ambrose Paré, a Protestant, to attend Coligny, and a guard of their own soldiers to protect his house. They offered the Protestant nobles lodgings round their leader, and they promised Coligny that there should be a strict search for the criminal and his prompt punishment. The house was at once searched, but the man, whoever he was, had escaped. These actions were, of course, put down by the Protestants to dissimulation on the part of the Queen Mother, but there is not a particle of proof to support the charge. They are just such as would be natural in the position in which Catherine found herself, placed between two bitterly hostile parties, who could only be kept at peace from hour to hour with difficulty, while a conflict within Paris itself threatened to engulf the throne, and would in any case bring to ruin all that Catherine had striven for and hoped that she had achieved by the marriage just concluded. This outrage upon Coligny brought matters to a climax. All through the 23rd August secret plots were going on, each party, frightened and suspicious, plotting to massacre the other, and at early dawn on the morning of the 24th, St. Bartholomew's Day, the Roman Catholic party suddenly rushed upon their opponents. Armed bands headed by the Guises, the Duke of Angoulême, and other Roman Catholic nobles, issued into the streets and roused the only too eager Paris mob to fall upon the Protestants throughout the city. The Duke of Guise at once hurried with all speed to Coligny's house, accompanied by a band of his own soldiers, who, overpowering the guard, forced their way into Coligny's chamber and murdered him. His party were taken by surprise. The fanatical hatred of the citizens burst forth like a river long dammed up, and the Protestants, with the exception of the Prince of Condé, the King of Navarre, Michel de l'Hôpital, and others whom Catherine protected, either in the Louvre or by sending strong guards to defend their houses, were brutally massacred throughout Paris. The historian Sully, speaking of this massacre, says, "The whole house of Guise had been personally animated against the admiral ever since the assassination of Francis, Duke of Guise, by Poltrot de Méré, whom they believed to have been instigated to this crime by Coligny. And it must be admitted that the admiral was never able to clear himself of the charge. If this cruel slaughter was, as many people are fully persuaded, only the effect of the revenge of the house of Guise, it must be confessed that no person ever executed so severe a vengeance for an offence as did Henry, Duke of Guise, for his noble father's murder. The Protestant writers have maintained that this massacre was a long premeditated scheme, but this view is no longer held by historians, fuller knowledge having shown that the Spanish ambassador, Cuniga, spoke the truth when he reported that, with the exception of the murder of Coligny, the rest was due to sudden impulse. It remains to consider whether Catherine is to be held responsible for this massacre, as on the authority of the infuriated Protestants has so long been declared, or whether the charge of responsibility on her part was only another result of their long-standing prejudice against her, one which made French Protestants prefer to lay this crime on the shoulders of the Italian woman rather than on any of their own nation. First, as to the murder of Coligny, one of the two murders which have always been charged against Catherine, and both of which accusations are now considered to have been unjustly made against her. The circumstances under which it is now known that Coligny's murder took place, the fact that Catherine is acknowledged to have had no special feeling against him, and above all, the fact that this murder meant the ruin of a plan to achieve which she had labored hard for 2 years, appear sufficient to dispose of this charge. Catherine's part in the massacre as a whole is a question on which, like that of the guilt or innocence of Mary, Queen of Scots, opposite opinions will probably always continue to be held, and this is inevitable, because the only records of her actions on these 3 days, 22nd to 24th August, are all furnished by persons who were violent partisans of one side or the other, and at a time when none took pen in hand with any other idea than to obscure the truth as much as possible for the advantage of his party. The Protestants desired to show the Queen Mother and her son the King as guilty of the crime perpetrated against themselves, while the Roman Catholics desired to show that in what they did the Queen Mother and the King were on their side. The following fact is eloquent as to the way in which, under such conditions, the history of this affair has been written. It was declared by the Protestants that Charles IX had himself assisted in the massacre by firing at their co-religionists from a window of the Louvre. The very window was pointed out, and so thoroughly was this fact supposed to be authenticated that a tablet to that effect was in after years affixed to the window. This tablet was, however, removed in 1802, on its being discovered that that wing of the palace was not even built until the reign of Henry IV. It is from accounts written in this fashion that we have to gather what Catherine's words and actions within the Louvre were at this time. None know really what went on in the Louvre during the 22nd and 23rd August preceding the commencement of the massacre on the morning of the 24th, and it is upon this that the question of Catherine's part in the matter turns. Two things only are certain. First, that of those around Catherine during these 3 days, there is not one, either Protestant or Roman Catholic, French, English, or Italian, whose word on the subject we can trust in the smallest degree. And second, that if Catherine were responsible for this massacre, then it was the only occasion in her life that she resorted to violent measures. Even the Venetian ambassadors fail us at this point in Catherine's history, and throw no lights as regards the massacre in August 1572. There is a long gap in the Venetian state papers at this part of the 16th century, the official dispatches of this period having been lost. The regular ambassador at this time at the court of France was Sigismondo Cavalli. In addition to him, an ambassador extraordinary, Giovanni Michieli, had just been deputed to that court for a special purpose connected with the proceedings of Spain and Flanders. And in default of the official dispatches, all that we have is a semi-private account by this Giovanni Michieli, which is by no means equally trustworthy. This purports to give a circumstantial report of the proceedings in the Louvre, charges Catherine with the sole responsibility both for Coligny's murder and for the general massacre, and states that her action was the result of a long premeditated plan, and that the whole scheme of the marriage of Henry of Navarre and Marguerite had been merely a trap to inveigle all the leading Protestants to Paris. But the remarks made by M. Mérimée show how little real value can be attached to this statement of Giovanni Michieli. M. Mérimée says, "I cannot admit that the same men could have been able to conceive a crime whose results must be so important, and to execute it so badly. The measures, in fact, were so ill taken that soon after the St. Bartholomew the war began afresh, the reformers certainly winning all the glory of it, and retiring from it with new advantages. In short, is not the assault on Coligny, which took place 2 days before the St. Bartholomew, sufficient to refute the supposition of a conspiracy? Why kill the chief before the general massacre? Was not this the way to alarm the Huguenots and put them on their guard?" Giovanni Michieli, in fact, was not in a position to furnish information of any value. He had only reached Paris a week or 2 before. He was unable to base his opinion on any observations of his own, as he appears to have had as yet no communication with the Queen Mother, who had only arrived from Lorraine just before the marriage, and he is only able to relate what he had heard on this subject from persons highly situated who have access to the secrets of the court. In other words, from just those persons whose evidence, as already noted, is in this case absolutely worthless. We are therefore left to form such inferences as we may from the surer ground of collateral evidence, and from the following considerations. 1. If Catherine was responsible for instigating this massacre, then she committed an act which is at variance with the whole of the rest of a policy steadily pursued by her for a long number of years, in spite of the greatest difficulties, and to carry out which she had made formidable enemies, and an act which entirely stultified that policy. 2. Again, if she was responsible for this massacre, then one possessing one of the most acute intellects ever seen upon a throne took action which caused all her special efforts of the preceding 2 years to be absolutely thrown away, and destroyed the effect of a marriage to achieve which she had undergone severe labors, and had incurred much odium from a large part of the French people. Also, it is impossible that she should not have foreseen that it would be at once declared that the marriage was a long premeditated scheme to entrap the Protestants to their destruction. 3. As this massacre began the Fourth Religious War, Catherine, who had everything to gain by peace and to lose by war, yet becomes by the hypothesis the deliberate originator of that war. How far the theory that Catherine de Medici was responsible for the massacre on St. Bartholomew's Day with these facts is a point which each must decide for himself. They cannot be slurred over or explained away, but must be faced. What, however, is probably the truest view of this question was long ago pointed out by a Protestant historian, the fair-minded Rank, who stated that the responsibility for this massacre had been unfairly placed by the French people on the shoulders of Catherine de Medici, whereas it was they themselves who must bear it, for that this massacre was caused entirely by their own state of wild fanaticism and the frenzied hatred by which at the moment both of the religious factions who faced each other in Paris were possessed. The two parties into which Frenchmen were divided, furiously embittered against each other by many cruel deeds during 10 years of conflict, and brought into close juxtaposition in a single city, were seething with animosity, and from the moment that Guise's retainer fired upon Coligny, were bent upon massacring each other. It was only a question of hours which should be the assailant, while the knowledge of what their opponents were planning drove each forward. The Protestant party, who had marched into Paris in confident strength, had already once before planned to massacre the Roman Catholics in Paris, and it was to a large extent fear of what their opponents might do which caused the rapid resolve of the Roman Catholics to be the first in the field. The night, the unexpected situation, the thought of having in the Louvre itself 30 or 40 of the most redoubtable Protestants, et par Delon et de Pile, the first swordsman of France, all combined to make Guise and his party rush to massacre their opponents before the latter should do the same to them, and to force the Queen Mother and the King to stand aside while they worked their will upon their foes. Catherine, between the two antagonists, had only one object, that which she had always had, to preserve the throne from being overwhelmed in the storm. But she was placed in a more difficult position than hitherto, owing to the close proximity of the two foes. Walsingham, the English minister, afterwards told her that it would have been easy to seize the persons who were plotting on the Protestant side, and so have avoided the explosion. But his argument took no account of the fact that any force with which she could have done so must have been a Roman Catholic one, and that would at once have brought about the same catastrophe. As far as can be judged in the absence of any record that can be trusted, Catherine, for once in her life, was thoroughly frightened, as well she might be, and seeing that a conflict was going to take place which she had no longer any power to prevent, sought only to keep herself and her children and her daughter's husband from being destroyed in it. While the massacre was spreading through the city, she sent her commands to the Roman Catholics to desist, but no one paid any attention to her, and for the time being Paris was as much beyond any control as a city in which a sack was taking place. The truth is that France had become by this time so maddened by these furious religious wars that such a massacre was likely at any time in any city, and as a matter of fact, as soon as the news of what had occurred in Paris spread, similar massacres did take place in one or two other towns. It is also evident that Queen Elizabeth of England did not attach much credit to the reports of Catherine's responsibility in the matter, for though she thought it politic to express her reprobation of the massacre, she did not break off the negotiations for her own marriage with Catherine's son. The above massacre ruined all Catherine's plans. During the visit which she and her son had paid to Coligny when he was wounded, Charles IX had said, looking angrily at the Duke of Guise, "It is I who am attacked," whereupon Catherine had added, "It is all France." And she was right. The flames of war were relighted, destined to cause still greater desolation and misery to France than even that which the country had already experienced. The Fourth Religious War began at once, and raged with great fury for the whole of the next 12 months, until in July 1578 a temporary truce was effected, called the Peace of Rochelle, as before on the lines of Catherine's now celebrated Edict of January.
The Peace of Rochelle proved nothing more than a 6 months' truce, and in February 1574 the Fifth Religious War broke out. 3 months later, in May 1574, Charles IX died, and as he left only a daughter, he was succeeded by his brother, Henry III, then 23. When Charles IX's queen, the good Elizabeth of Austria, was condoled with because her child was not a boy, she replied that she was glad of it, since that would only have added yet further divisions to cause affliction to distracted France. Henry III, Catherine's favourite son, who now ascended the throne, was a strange character, inheriting more of his father's peculiar disposition than either of his brothers, but with all his father's weak points greatly intensified. He had plenty of intelligence, had been made lieutenant general of the realm, and had taken part with distinction in the various campaigns during the previous 5 years, including the battles of Jarnac and Moncontour, and had 8 months before been elected as King of Poland, where he governed with much success, and won the greatest admiration from the Poles, notwithstanding that they were mostly Protestants. But his abilities were combined with an indolence, which caused him, on becoming King of France, to make his mother undertake all affairs that were troublesome, and also with a taste for the most extravagant follies, a taste which became more pronounced as he grew older. On hearing in Poland that he had become King of France, he arranged a midnight escape from his faithful Polish subjects, in the manner of a conspirator fleeing for his life. Entertaining at this time a violent passion for the Princess of Condé, he poured forth the most extravagant sentiments to her in letters written in his blood, but on hearing of her sudden death, he showed his grief by wearing little silver death's heads all over his dress, even on his shoe ribbons, and after a week appeared completely to forget her, and became entirely occupied in making proposals of marriage to a young lady, Louise de Vaudemont, whom he had chanced to see a month or two before at Nancy. Meanwhile he went off to Avignon, and while there joined the Flagellants, and insisted on the ladies of the court, and even his mother, doing so also. His follies and extravagant vagaries were innumerable, each more fantastic than the last. His mother idolized him, she could refuse him nothing, and those who have held that Catherine de Medici was without the softer feelings natural to a woman have only to study the expressions in her letters wherever the name of her son Henry occurs, to discover that this view is far from the truth. We have a somewhat touching glimpse of Catherine at this period, in connection with a visit which, while staying at Lyons, she paid to the studio of the painter Corneille de Lion. There, looking round the pictures on the walls, she saw one of herself as she had been about 25 years before, attired in the French mode, with a little cap edged with pearls, and a dress having large sleeves of silver tissue, lined with links. After gazing at it sadly for a few moments, recalling as it did the memories of the years of her long trial in the days of Diane de Poitiers, she turned to the Duc de Nemours and said, "Cousin, you remember well the time and fashion of this picture, and you can say, better than any of those around us, if I was once as I am painted here." Henry III. was crowned at Rheims on the 18th February 1575, and 2 days afterwards married Louise de Vaudemont. Her father was the Count de Vaudemont, and it speaks well for Henry, as a counterpoise to his many follies, that he thus chose for himself the daughter of a simple gentleman of France, whose family were not even wealthy, rather than any of the royal princesses who had been spoken of as a desirable match for the new King of France. His choice proved an excellent one. Louise had a charming character, her beautiful disposition, modesty, wisdom, and innate goodness being praised by all writers. She shone like a star amidst the corruptions of the court, yet gave offence to none, and was respected by all around her, while her husband invariably treated her with deference and affection. Both Protestants and Roman Catholics had at least found one point, at all events, on which they could agree, for both of them loved and reverenced la Reine Blanche, as Louise came to be called. And it is one of the brightest spots in the character of Catherine de Medici that she was intensely fond of Louise de Vaudemont, and showed it to the last hour of her life. Meanwhile, the Fifth Religious War continued to rage over France, and an end to the conflict seemed as far off as ever, though, we are told, the Queen Mother did not cease to labour for peace, tooth and nail. At last, however, in April 1576, a peace was concluded at Beaulieu, again on the basis of Catherine's Edict of January, and this time France obtained rest for nearly a year. Nothing could better show how thoroughly the edict, for which Catherine had fought and won her struggle with the Parlement in January 1562, provided just that balance between the two parties which the needs of France required, than the fact that again and again after war had raged, we find the Protestants, in negotiating for peace, stipulating for the terms of this edict, and again find peace between the combatants made on its basis. If only the two parties had been sufficiently ready to live and let live to have adhered to it, France would, through Catherine's celebrated measure of toleration, have saved herself many years of misery. Some have held that there was in Catherine's career as the ruling spirit of France a Protestant period and a Roman Catholic period, and a complete change from the former to the latter after the year 1562. But this constant attainment of peace on the basis of her Edict of January, time after time for so many years afterwards, entirely contradicts this, and refutes the idea that there was ever this change in her attitude. It was just because her attitude remained always unchanged that the same edict, published so many years before, was able to form the basis of each peace that she brought about. This spirit of tolerance and natural attraction for freedom is a remarkable feature in Catherine's character, in view of the opinion on that point which was universal in her day. Nothing roused greater wrath and contempt in the men of that age than to note a spirit of tolerance in a ruler. They invariably attributed it to either weakness, lukewarmness, or duplicity. And seeing that, after all, Catherine was a Roman Catholic, and as such necessarily had more sympathy with that side in the contest, that she should so steadfastly have adopted a policy of toleration shows a degree of broad-minded statesmanship of which she had considerable reason to be proud. It was undoubtedly due to Florentine ideas, and to that republican atmosphere in which she had been born and brought up, and which had been traditional in her family. Ideas of freedom in political life lead naturally to ideas of freedom in religion. One outcome of this spirit on Catherine's part was a notable one. For when we remember how terrible were the horrors of the Inquisition, nothing tends more strongly to make us regard Catherine de Medici with favor than the fact that, at a time when the Inquisition was perpetrating its detestable enormities in every other country round, in Spain, in Italy, in the Netherlands, and every other Roman Catholic country, Catherine boldly refused, during all the years of her life, to allow it to be established in France. This brought upon her the enmity of both the Pope and the fanatical Philip II of Spain, whose vengeance in the defenceless state of France could only be warded off by much diplomacy on Catherine's part, with, as a result, many accusations against her of duplicity. Nevertheless, Catherine was as iron on this point, and the anchor which was the sole protection of many lives from horrible tortures and death was not to be torn from its hold. Repeatedly we find men whose lives were in danger from this cause in the adjacent countries flying to Catherine for protection, and obtaining it. One of the most notable of these was Carnesecchi, a Florentine who, becoming one of the chief of the Protestant reformers in Italy, was pronounced by the Pope a refractory heretic. Forced to fly for his life from Italy, he was protected by Catherine from the wrath of the Pope, and when, after a long residence in France, he ventured to return to Florence, Catherine wrote to her kinsman, Cosimo I, urging him to protect Carnesecchi as she had done, the disregard of which recommendation resulted in Carnesecchi's being burnt in Rome by the Inquisition. The Peace of Beaulieu having once more brought a tranquil state of affairs, Catherine, who had inaugurated the reign of each of her other sons by a fête at Chenonceau, did the same in Henry III's case. That which she now held for him was on a more splendid scale than any which had taken place before, every effort being employed to make the occasion as joyous as possible, and with the hope that at last the miseries of war were at an end. But what we chiefly hear of in connection with the festivities are the extravagant follies of Henry. He received the guests dressed as a woman, with jewels in his hair, earrings in his ears, strings of pearls round his bared neck, an embroidered collar, and high ruff. His youthful courtiers were arrayed in a similar manner. while by his desire the ladies of the court were attired as men, but with bare shoulders and flowing hair. But the sunshine was only temporary, and the storm clouds were soon again gathered over France. From the first, the Guises had refused to be bound by the peace made at Beaulieu, as they had declared it to be too favourable to the Protestants. They therefore now formed the celebrated League, with Henry, Duke of Guise, at its head, for the defence of the interests of the Roman Catholic party. This league had for its policy one the exact opposite of Catherine's, being formed to overturn her principle of a recognition by the state of two religions side by side in France; and while she laboured steadily to attain peace by means of this principle, the League strove to keep up a state of war until Protestantism should have been crushed, and was the cause of innumerable troubles to France during the next 20 years. The first result of the formation of the League was that the Guises were enabled so to manipulate the elections that the States General, when assembled, consisted almost entirely of deputies opposed to the principle of the toleration of two religions; and on the 1st January 1577 this assembly declared themselves in favour of one religion only, and forced the king to abolish the Edict of January. The Protestants at once took up arms, were assisted with money by Elizabeth of England, and the sixth religious war began. It lasted for 9 months, but in September the principle of tolerating both religions was again agreed to, and a peace was made at Bergerac in September 1577. Catherine was now approaching 60 years of age, and her appearance was very different from that which she had borne in the days of Henry II. Instead of the beautiful figure for which she had been so admired during all the earlier portion of her life in France, she was now immensely stout. But she still danced and rode, played games, and excelled in shooting with the crossbow. Her complexion was fresh. She had not a wrinkle on her full round face, which was set off by the long black widow's veil she always wore, fastened back from her forehead and falling down upon her shoulders. This was for indoors. When she went out, she put a little woolen hat upon the top of it. Had we met her, we should have probably thought her a jolly soul, a little inclined to be cynical. But we should have found her good company, colloquial in her speech, with vivid turns of expression. At times, however, she could blaze out as fiercely as Queen Elizabeth of England herself, but with more dignity. One who knew her well has said, "She had these moods not seldom, even with the greatest princes, and at such times she was possessed by anger, and took a lofty tone. Nor was anything in the world so superb as she on such occasions, for her tongue spared the truth to no one." Her ability for business and power of concentration were marvellous. Brantôme says that he watched her write 20 long letters in an afternoon. And on one of those uncomfortable journeys in a litter to which ladies were then subjected, she, unconscious of joltings and of stoppings, would read through 10 pages of parchment, a dry procès-verbal, as if she were a lawyer or reporter, without lifting her eyes till she had finished. Her style in writing is businesslike and terse, illumined here and there by homely wit and racy phrase. Perhaps nothing better shows Catherine's strong nature and entire freedom from all small-minded vanity than her tolerance of jokes against herself. When she heard that the Protestants called their biggest cannon La Reine Mère, because it was so heavy and unwieldy that they could not move it, a joke which few ladies of stout figure would relish, she only laughed in the most good-natured manner at the unflattering jest. For that of her nature she was jovial and loved a good repartee. A contemporary writer says, "She was never gayer than when someone brought her a good satire against herself, the bitterer, ruder, coarser the better." Once, when she and the King of Navarre were standing in the window of a ground-floor room, they listened to 2 vagrants outside, who were roasting a goose. and who, as they did so, talked loudly, telling ugly stories of the Queen, cursing her and giving her foul names for all the evil she had done to them. Whereupon the King of Navarre wished to take leave of her, intending to go and have them hanged. But she only called through the window to them, "Eh, what after all has she done to you? It is thanks to her that you have that goose to roast." In her letters to her son Henry, she often displays the sadness of heart which came over her as she saw him more and more given up to follies, and surrounding himself with others more foolish than himself, whose advice he took instead of hers. She writes to him, "Give orders for someone to tell me how your affairs are going. I do not ask this because I wish to control them, but because if they go well my heart will be at ease, and if they go ill I can help your trouble. For you are my all, and whether or no you love me, you do not trust me as you ought. Forgive me if I speak straight out like this. I have no wish to live any longer. I have never cared for life since your father died, excepting as I might serve you and God." In another letter to him she says, "And this is my request, that you will publish anew the ordinance forbidding swearing and blaspheming, and will punish those who do not keep it, and firmly resolve not to give either bishopric or any benefice with the cure of souls, excepting to learned men of good life." In August 1578, hostilities again threatening to break out, Catherine, her son Henry III having none of the gift which she possessed for reconciling hostile parties, set out on a prolonged tour through the south of France, in order to prevent war if possible, the first of those wonderful journeys of pacification in which she was engaged during the greater part of the next 3 years. To Bellièvre, her intendant of finance, she writes, "It seems to me that one ought to quit everything else, and to employ every means to avert the storm of war. I am determined not to return until I see peace. But if God gives me grace to fulfil my desires, I hope that this kingdom will feel the good of my labors, and that enduring peace will reign there." One gazes in astonishment at this woman of 60, hampered by bodily infirmities and the difficulties of travel at that period in France, and confronted by such apparently insuperable obstacles in the irreconcilable temper towards each other of the two hostile parties, resolutely setting forth, notwithstanding that it was an acute pain to her to thus absent herself from the son whom she adored, determined to overcome all difficulties, to carry out the motto she had chosen when a girl of 15, and to bring serenity to her adopted country, and displaying a power of endurance and an ability to win success even under the most adverse conditions, which have extorted admiration even from those most prejudiced against her. For example, Miss Sichel says, "It is impossible not to admire the indomitable spirit with which, as she grew older, she pursued her object in the face of every hardship, every obstacle. Between 1578 and 1581 she knew no repose. Driven by her purpose, she was continually traversing France, amidst perils and discomforts unimaginable. So heavy in person that motion meant suffering, she was always on the move. So rheumatic that acute pain was chronic, she uncomplainingly braved every kind of climate. Now she was carried in her litter under a burning sun. Now she was snowed up for weeks, amid all the bodily privations and the difficulties of getting provisions that winter in the country then signified. The provinces to which Catherine chiefly turned her attention in this attempt to prevent war were Guienne, Languedoc, Provence, and Dauphiné. She received no encouragement from those around her in regard to the task upon which she was bent. All thought, and said, that it was a hopeless endeavour, the hatred between the two factions having grown so implacable, and that she was attempting the impossible. Nevertheless, she managed to bring about a conference between the two opposing parties, and so successful was she in allaying their mutual feelings of enmity, that she ended by getting articles of agreement which placed the two religions on an equal footing, drawn up and signed by both sides at Nerac in February 1579, and war was once more averted. Catherine's satisfaction at her success was naturally considerable. To the Duchesse d'Uzès she says in another letter, "You have understood me, and I you, for more than 40 years of kindly memories." And to this lifelong friend she now writes, "I have finished my labours here, and in my humble opinion have made a great many persons to lie, for I have achieved that which was said to be impossible." But there were other provinces still to be visited, where the difficulties were even greater. Thus, in coming to Montpellier, she approached a city which was on the verge of an appeal to arms, and known to be inimical to her personally. She writes to her son, "I walked the whole length of the city walls and reached the gate, which I found guarded by arquebusiers, as I had been told. But that did not prevent me from going on fearlessly, without showing dread or mistrust, although they were all so near my coach, especially as the road there is narrow, that the butts of their arquebuses nearly touched my carriage. The councils, in their red robes and their caps, together with a great crowd of people of both religions who followed them, came to meet me with all humility, offering you and me their property and lives, with all the devotion of loyal subjects, and both parties promised me on their honour to live according to my commands. When I got nearly opposite the gate, another great crowd of people came out of the town, all showing a more friendly feeling than I had been led to expect. The fact that I had gone among them so freely helped a good deal, I am told, to increase their confidence, and also their certainty that peace was near. I thought to have managed to sleep here yesterday, so as to escape the risk of the plague, by making one day's journey, getting earlier to Provence, but I felt rather tired, as I did full 6 leagues among the rocks of this district before my dinner." In the recent troubles every church in the town had been destroyed except one, and this had become a bone of contention. The Protestants claimed half of it. The Roman Catholics refused to worship under the same roof, and claimed the whole building. She got them to refer the knotty point to her, and after much acrid discussion arranged an amicable settlement. In this manner Catherine travelled hither and thither, smoothing difficulties, overcoming obstacles deliberately contrived to frustrate her purpose, producing smiles where she had been met with frowns, and settling innumerable disputes. Last of all she reached Dauphiné, regarding which province she writes to the Duchesse d'Uzès. "Here I am in your land of Dauphiné, the hilliest and most aggravating in which I have hitherto been. Every day there is cold, heat, rain, fine weather, hail, and the characters of the people here are just the same. But God who leads me is bringing me to my goal, and in 10 days I shall be in my beloved France, and in the city where is the dearest thing I have in the world. Report says that you govern him. Keep me in his good graces, and tell Descartes that since she has sat next to him at dinner, I am sure he no longer wishes to die." Again to the same friend she writes, "Were it not for the plague, I would bring you news of your estate, but all the neighbourhood round Uzès is so very much infected that they say even the birds flying past it fall dead. This has made me take the other road, between the lakes and the sea, and there we had to sleep 2 nights in tents, camping thus in the service of my king, whom I long to see again in good health. As for me, mine is good, excepting that Port Saint Marie has given me a troublesome catarrh, which at the moment has turned to sciatica. However, this does not prevent my walking, not very well though, so that I am forced to have a little mule to ride upon occasions. I think that the king would laugh if he saw me on it, looking so exactly like the Maréchal de Cossé. But if one goes on living one must grow old, and truly one is very lucky not to feel it more. You have to ride in a carrying chair, I upon a mule, because I like to travel farther than you do. Tell me that I shall be welcome when I return." At length her task was accomplished. Peace had been created, for a time, in Guienne, Languedoc, Provence, and Dauphiné. but scarcely had she returned with a joyful heart to Paris when similar troubles began in the north, and she had to set forth again on a journey in December into Picardy, where she also succeeded for a time in averting war. But the two religious parties had not yet learnt to live at peace together. Their adherents could never refrain for long from insulting each other's religion, thereby provoking brawls which quickly developed into open war. And in this conduct the Protestants were not a whit behind their opponents, while they always had a strong tendency to invoke foreign aid, a course which enlisted against them everyone who had a patriotic feeling for France. As before, therefore, this inherent animosity again produced its natural result, and in March 1580 the seventh religious war began. After continuing for 8 months, this war was brought to an end in November by the Peace of Flaix, the terms of which were almost exactly the same as the agreement which Catherine had got the two parties to sign at Nérac. This peace, joined to the exhausted state of France, created by wars which had continued almost incessantly for 14 years, now caused a cessation of the contest for 4 years, 1581 to 1585. Though during these years there were, from time to time, local conflicts in different parts of France, while the state of general disorder into which the country had been brought by this long and bitter struggle was deplorable. In June 1584 Catherine's fourth son, the Duc d'Alençon, died, which, as Louise de Vaudemont had no children, left Henry of Navarre the next heir to the throne. Catherine's many sorrows, disappointments, and bereavements began to weigh heavily upon her. She writes about this time, "I am so much accustomed never to have an unspoiled joy that it does not seem so strange to me as it would to another. That God will be pitiful to me who have lost so many, that he will not let me see any more of them die, that is what I pray of his mercy, and that he will allow me to depart as befits my age." Catherine de Medici praying that, because so many of her dear ones are gone, she may depart this life as befits her age, is certainly not the picture of her which has been painted for us by a long succession of writers. Yet these are her own written words, unearthed after 3 centuries by the patient labor of an age which seeks to base its knowledge of history on more sure foundations than those which sufficed for previous times. In July 1585 the operations of the League caused the commencement of the 8th religious war, sometimes called the War of the Three Henries, between Henry III, Henry of Navarre, and the League under Henry, Duke of Guise. Catherine was now 66 years old, and was wearied with this long struggle to create peace. Nevertheless, before this war began she took a toilsome journey into Champagne to endeavour to induce Guise to keep from war, but without avail. About this time also she became so disgusted with the follies of Henry III, and the persistency with which he insisted on invariably choosing the most ill-advised courses of action, that she removed from the Louvre and gave up taking any part in public affairs. We read of her ordering her attendants to carry her chair outside the city walls, and to put her down for a while in the green fields, that she might, amid the quiet peace of country scenes, gain some rest of mind, and allay her utter weariness of spirit at the political condition of the country and her son's refusal to listen to her advice. But Catherine had adopted France as her country, and notwithstanding the long abuse she had endured from the French, was as intensely national as if born a Frenchwoman. And when she saw 1/3 of the kingdom occupied by the troops of the League, another third by those of Henry of Navarre, a German army also invading the country, and France threatened with complete dismemberment, she came forth from her retirement to make one more effort to save the country and her son's throne. War now raged over the whole of France. But Catherine, though she was by this time 68, set out on the last of her many journeys in the cause of peace, one which required no little courage, and travelling through a large part of France which was in revolt from her son, held a meeting with Henry of Navarre near Cognac. This, however, produced only partial results, while news of the alarming state of affairs in Paris, created by the machinations of the League, necessitated her hurrying back to the capital. On her way thither, she heard at Mort, in February 1587, of Elizabeth of England having had Mary Queen of Scots executed, that daughter-in-law to whom Catherine had set Latin exercises, and of whom she had written 28 years before that she had only to smile to turn all Frenchmen's heads. Elizabeth had put Mary to death because she was a dangerous rival to her throne, and on account of the plots against herself of which Mary had become the centre. If it did not cross Catherine's own mind, it must have crossed the minds of others that Elizabeth's position in the matter was exactly that in which Catherine had been placed in December 1560 with regard to the Prince of Condé, and yet that she had not acted as Elizabeth had done, even though she would have had more excuse, since she had merely to allow, as she was strongly pressed to do, a sentence of death already passed against him by others to take effect. On arrival in Paris, Catherine found a revolutionary government installed there, which, prompted by the League, was intriguing with Spain both to seize the king and also to make over Boulogne to Philip II, in order to assist the Armada which he was preparing for the invasion of England. However, these plans were eventually foiled, and after a time Henry III was able to leave Paris in command of an army to attack the Germans and expel them from France. The war continued during the rest of the year 1587, but at length in February 1588 a sort of peace was patched up between Henry III and the Duke of Guise. Paris, however, was entirely on the side of the latter, and on the verge of revolution. The king therefore ordered Guise not to come to the capital. This order he disobeyed, pretending not to have understood it, and entered the city on the 9th May, being received in the streets with the usual shouts of "One religion." The king was urged by those around him to have Guise assassinated on his leaving the Louvre, and had determined on doing so. But at the interview between the king and Guise, Catherine, suddenly seeing what her son contemplated, took him aside and spoke to him so forcibly that he allowed Guise, who on entering the Louvre had wondered if he should leave the palace alive, to depart unharmed. 3 days later Paris rose in revolt on behalf of Guise and the League. Barricades were quickly erected, cutting off the different quarters of the royal troops from each other. The Swiss troops were forced to surrender, and the king, with his wife Louise and his mother, protected by a very small force, were besieged in the Louvre. Henry III's cause seemed ruined, and Catherine must have felt that it was chiefly his own fault, through the many follies he had committed. We are told that as the king, the queen, and the queen mother sat at dinner on the evening that this revolution took place, Catherine, while her son sat unmoved, silently shed great tears throughout the entire repast. However, next day Henry managed to escape from the Louvre, and fled from Paris, leaving his mother to see what she could do by her well-known gift for reconciliation. Issuing from the Louvre almost unaccompanied, Catherine went to seek the Duke of Guise. Her journey across the city was a difficult operation. The streets were everywhere blocked by barricades, and in each of these it was necessary to induce those who guarded them to allow her to pass and to make an opening for her sedan chair. But though the Leaguers were in open rebellion, she induced them to do so, all heads being uncovered to the Queen Mother. Nothing could show better than this the influence which Catherine, once so despised by the French people, had in 30 years gained among them. As so often before, she was successful in assuaging the angry passions raging, and though everything was against her, she succeeded in getting Guise to accompany her to Chartres, where the king was, and in arranging terms of peace, though the latter practically left Guise all powerful in the kingdom. 11th July 1588. Within a fortnight after this peace was made in France, the Spanish Armada appeared off the coast of Cornwall, and the great 10 days' naval battle between Spain and England began, in which the maritime power of Spain was utterly destroyed. But peace was not yet come to France, and round Catherine's deathbed the storm was still to rage. Henry III. Was now determined to assassinate Guise, but remembering what had taken place before, carefully kept his design from his mother. Catherine, worn out by so many labours and anxieties, was by this time in a dying condition, and removed to Blois, that fortified chateau on the Loire which Francis I. had so greatly improved and enlarged. Thither, in October, the king summoned the States General to assemble, and there, on the 28th December, 1588, Henry carried out his plot to rid himself of the Duke of Guise. In the great northern wing, built by Francis I., and affording such a splendid example of French Renaissance architecture, Catherine, in her richly decorated range of apartments, lay dying. Close by rose the wonderful outside staircase, the escalier azur, which for more than 50 years back she had so often seen thronged by the laughing groups of the petite bande. But a very different atmosphere now pervaded the castle of Blois, and the gloom of tragedy and death overshadowed the abode which Francis had delighted to see brightened with the smiles of beauty, and resounding with laughter and the sallies of wit. Catherine's apartments were on the first floor, while the king occupied the suite of apartments on the floor above, and he had warned all in the plot, on pain of death, not to allow the Queen Mother to know what was going on. The murder was secretly debated by the king and council after the manner of an execution. It was to be carried out by the 45, the band of gentlemen which Henry had formed as his personal bodyguard. Some of the band were placed in the king's bedchamber, and some in the passage outside it. The Duke of Guise, who had received intimation that there was a plot on foot, but would not attend to the warning, being summoned from the council chamber to speak with the king in his cabinet, was attacked as he went thither by the members of the 45 stationed for that purpose, and fell dead on the floor of the king's bedchamber. Henry III. At once descended to his mother's apartments, and entering the room where she lay ill, announced to her what he had done, saying that now at last he felt secure on his throne. Catherine, knowing what the vengeance of the League would be, and how this deed would again set light to the fires of war, but too ill to attempt any longer to guide the vessel amidst so many breakers, told him he was much mistaken, and would live to repent his act. Weak as she was, she dragged herself from her bed and went to visit the old Cardinal Bourbon in the prison to which he had been consigned by the king's orders. But he only greeted her with the old cry that all these misfortunes were the result of her policy of tolerating two religions. The injustice of these reproaches, combined with distress of mind on account of the trouble she correctly foresaw would be the result of her son's deed, threw her into a high fever, and on returning from the interview she took to her bed, never to rise from it again. And a few days later, on the 5th January 1589, Catherine de Medici ended her long and storm-tossed life. She was 3 months short of 70 years of age when she died. 2 women attended her affectionately throughout her illness, and were with her to the last: her much-loved daughter-in-law, Louise de Vaudemont, and her favourite granddaughter, Christine of Lorraine. To the former, Catherine left, as a parting gift, her beloved chateau of Chenonceau, a solid boon to Louise, who on her husband's death shortly afterwards was left very badly off. Catherine during her lifetime had erected in St. Denis a double monument for Henry II. And herself, but when she died, the war which at once broke out again on the murder of the Duke of Guise did not permit of her body being removed thither, and she was buried temporarily in the chapel at Blois. But in 1609, at the entreaty of the Duchess of Angoulême, who had always liked Catherine, her remains were removed by Henry IV. to St. Denis, and buried by the side of her husband. The monument over them consists of the two recumbent figures of Henry II and Catherine, lying on a bronze couch. The character of Catherine de Medici, as it stands revealed to us by the fuller information we now possess, and divested of that cloud of mystery, fable, and misrepresentation which has so long been gathered round it by partisan writers, is not difficult to unravel. That which is its salient feature is the extraordinary way in which, though always suffering abuse as an Italian, she threw herself heart and soul into the cause of France, and amidst difficulties, dangers, and discouragements enough to have made the stoutest heart abandon the effort in despair, labored from the age of 42 to that of 70 to bring peace to a country devastated by a succession of vindictive wars. Thus one of those Venetian ambassadors who have so often formed our guides in this study of her life, calls her the great moderatress, while the highest authority has said of her that she was an indefatigable worker in the cause of peace in her adopted country. In the previous history of Catherine's family, we have seen that one of their chief characteristics was a unique gift for abating strife, and making those who were at feud lay aside their enmity and live at peace. It was their special talent in this respect which had helped them to rise, and had made their rule of Florence so successful. And in Catherine, this family characteristic comes out in even stronger degree than in any of her ancestors. Again and again, at Orléans, at Roussillon, at Saint-Germain-en-Laye, at Beaulieu, at Nerac, at Flaix, at Chartres, and on many other occasions, she proved her peculiar gift for pouring oil on troubled waters and getting bitter foes to make peace. This is the chief characteristic which she shows during the 30 years of her widowhood. The other qualities which she possessed have been successively indicated by the facts of her life as we have followed her long and harassed career from her childhood in the Medici Palace in Florence to her death at gloom darkened Blois. And if any indication of character is afforded, as it is, by the persons whom an individual has chiefly liked through life, then it is not without significance that, omitting her husband and children, the persons of whom at different times in her life we find Catherine chiefly fond, nay more, the only persons of whom we hear that she was specially fond, are the nuns at the Murate, Maria Salviati, Elizabeth of Austria, and above all Louise de Vaudemont. The three latter, all of them, women who in a corrupt age were like shining lights in a dark sky. Nor again is it without significance that so many notable Protestants should have owed their lives to her, such as Condé, Navarre, de l'Hôpital, Aldobrandini, Canacecchi, and others; or that one who, in the circumstances of France, had special reason to dread making unnecessary foes, should yet have endured the wrath of the Pope and the King of Spain rather than ever permit the Inquisition to be established in the country she ruled. These things, together with the fact that the two murders of which she has in former days been accused are now acknowledged to have been unjustly laid at her door, necessitate a very different view of the character of Catherine de Medici from that which has been handed down to us by the biased historians of an age of bitter conflict, and has so long provided material for the writers of sensational fiction. It has already been remarked that to those who start from the basis that she was a villain, Catherine de Medici will always be an enigma. To look at her with affection is impossible. One might as well feel affection for a 100-ton gun. On the other hand, those who regard her with hatred are not those who can draw a true picture of her. Inevitably, under such auspices, stories long since discarded by history are given more or less credit. Points which tell against her are painted in unduly strong colours, and those which tell in her favour are belittled and robbed of any weight by the manner in which they are put, until a figure is produced which is an incongruous impossibility, and which has to be declared as an enigma and a paradox. Those only will understand Catherine de Medici who will look at her with a calm dispassionateness. If, then, we may neither hate nor love, what remains? admiration for strength, for great ability, for untiring energy, for a self-control which has seldom been equaled, for a wisdom beyond her time, enabling her to see that the only policy which can give peace to a country whose people have taken up opposite views in religion is that of causing different religious bodies to learn to live side by side without conflict, for steadfast determination to do the best for France, for persevering endeavor through countless discouragements to be a peacemaker. These are the things, confessed even by her enemies, which we are to admire in Catherine de Medici, and each fresh record brought to light shows more clearly that they are justly to be attributed to her. She did not succeed, but she splendidly tried. And it is certain that where she did not succeed, none other of her time would have done so, for neither in Germany, England, or Flanders was it found possible to prevent the forces let loose by the Reformation from resulting in similar conflicts, while in none of those countries was the attempt made, as it was made in France, to attain that mutual toleration which all countries have since found is the only sound policy. We have surveyed the task. We have seen the effort which Catherine made to cope with it. Sectarian partisans may continue to battle over her conduct, but the point on which the historian will fix his eye is: did Catherine, amidst the terrible woes which came upon the French people through the birth of a new form of religion, by her actions increase those woes, or did she diminish them? This is the sole issue upon which history, as distinguished from religious controversy, will fix its attention and will judge her. And on this issue there is no doubt at all what the verdict will be. In fact, it has already been pronounced. Her splendid fight for a hitherto unheard of principle, that two religions should be allowed to exist, each recognized by the state, was a fight to bring peace to France by what we all now know to be the only means by which peace in such matters can be either obtained or preserved. And beginning from her three magnificent efforts in the year 1561 by this means to prevent France from drifting into civil war, down to the seventh and last occasion when she brought about peace for a time by the same means, Catherine at each juncture did the most that anyone could do to prevent or to allay the miseries of France. And just so far as she obtained pauses in the conflict, some of them lasting for several years, did she assuage and diminish the sufferings which that conflict created, with the result that the name given her by the leading modern authority on the subject, in summing up her character and work, is that of an indefatigable peacemaker. And with that verdict, the whole issue regarding her conduct is conclusively given in her favor. Upon this last scion of Cosimo's branch devolved a task severer far than had fallen to the lot of any of her family who had gone before. Even that of her ancestor, Cosimo Pater Patriae, pales before that which fell upon the shoulders of his last descendant, the baby girl upon whom in her cradle Cardinal Giulio had looked down in the almost empty Medici palace, and round whose path he wove so many thorny briars.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.